yesterday night with this wonderful view to the football stadium in days of the FIFA World Cup. And I hope that one of the 15 national teams from OSCE member countries will have the chance to win the FIFA World Cup. But now we have to return to work. And we continue, because discussions are a very important part of our work. And we were yesterday focused on the war of Ukraine, and we will be focused today on this issue, of course. Yesterday, we had in the center of our discussion the economic and environmental consequences. Today, we turn to protecting fundamental rights and freedoms in situations of armed conflict and humanitarian crisis. The tragic reality is that as a result of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, basic rights and freedoms for millions of people are not being protected. As a starting point, only some figures. The United Nations have recorded 16,784 civilian casualties in Ukraine, 6,595 killed, 10,189 injured. So for more than 6,000 innocent civilians, the most basic right to life has been taken away from them. And this is not taking into account the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Millions more have been displaced. The United Nations has also documented destruction and damage to civilian infrastructure, unlawful killings, sexual violence and enforced disappearance, torture and ill treatment. I would remind you that in our Birmingham Declaration a few months ago, we paid particular attention to the importance of access for humanitarian agencies and investigations and accountability for those responsible for any war crimes. The challenge, colleagues, is massive. But I hope that our discussion today will demonstrate that together we have the political will to do what responsible politicians can do. This war is an affront to the principles of our organization. But it is first and foremost an attack against people, innocent people. I hope we can have their best interests in mind today. And I'm therefore pleased that we are joined by two eminent speakers who are well placed to lead and contribute at the beginning of our discussion. Allow me first to introduce Mr. Matteo Mecacci, Director of OSCE ODIHR, as you know, situated here in Warsaw. I think that many of us, Matteo does not need introduction, and I'm really thankful for all your support when we are observing elections. It is very important for our Parliamentary Assembly doing this work, and here, without your support, we would not be able to fulfill this duty, how I see it. This is our duty to observe elections. So you, as a former member of the Italian Parliament and an active member of our Assembly, the older one like me, we know this. You are well known in OSCE PA. You lead this OSCE Human Rights Office now for 2 years, and we are thankful that you are joining us. We look forward to hearing your insights, and as I understood, afterwards we will have a reception at your office, which is nice. Thank you very much. I think this is an excellent opportunity to meet with your expert staff. Of course, we know some of them, all the colleagues who are observing elections, and that we can learn more about what the organization does in the field of human rights, We had the chance also to have an expert yesterday in our countering terrorism committee, because also there we have to be focused on human rights. So, Matteo, the floor is yours, and I'm happy that meanwhile the SEM is full.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, Excellencies, dear members of Parliament, friends. I want to thank also not only the older member of this Assembly whom I met personally in the past, but also the staff of the national delegation with whom I've been engaging for many, many years when I was with you. My sincere thanks goes also to Margareta Sederfeld, the President of the PA, for the invitation to participate into this discussion today and in this very important meeting that you are having here in Warsaw for your autumn meeting. I want to thank also the International Secretariat of the PA. The President had kind words about the support that we give to you during election observation, but we received the same from your staff and from you all, and so we are very thankful for that as well. Having been a member of this Assembly, naturally it's a special pleasure to be here, and this shows not only the strength of our partnership, but I think also my desire, and I think our joint desire to strengthen this partnership in a moment in which we all understand that keeping the human dimension is essential for the comprehensive concept of security of the OSCE. As I mentioned before, the relationship between the PA and ODIHR can become stronger and can be one of the most effective tools that the OSCE can deploy, especially in time of crisis. For us, for me, having strong parliaments across the OSCE region and the importance of these cannot be overstated, and I think it's very clear, it's very evident when we have to overcome security crisis, as we all see in the OSCE region, and where both political and diplomatic will is needed to address these things, while at the same time ensuring that the human rights approach is kept at the center of the solutions that are found. Holding governments accountable, giving voice to those whose rights have been restricted, and promoting positive changes on behalf of citizens will shape in no small part how we get out of these geopolitical tensions, which are coming on top of the COVID crisis that we have seen, and we also see coming on the horizon the threat of economic recession across the OSCE area. So overall, I'm very pleased for the support that we received from the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly to a number of ODIHR programs and activities, which I must say have continued to grow over the last few years and I think can continue to grow more. I just want to mention a few of them for your reference, but we have been working together on the issues of parliamentary integrity, violence against women, including violence against women who are involved in politics, the rule of law, hate crimes, and of course, our joint election observation mission, which the chairman has mentioned already. Since I started almost 2 years ago, we have conducted 10 election joint observations together. And as a result of this, I think we have produced more comprehensive and more clear assessment. So we are thankful for your contribution in this regard. This year alone, we have been doing joint observation missions in Serbia, Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the United States. But our cooperation goes beyond the moment of election observation, and this is important. I would like to spend 1 minute on this, because we need the support to ensure that the consequential electoral reforms are then implemented in the national parliament. And I think I would like to really appeal to each of you as national members of the OSCE PA delegation, because most of the recommendations that we produce as part of the election observations in the final report will need to be implemented by national parliaments to make sure that the national legislation, it is in line with the international standards. And here, I think the national delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly can take a leading role within the national parliaments to make sure that as your country is part of the OSCE, we all have the privilege but also the responsibility to make sure that our own countries are true to these commitments that have been made to be part of the OSCE. As it has been mentioned by the chairman, later we'll be hosting, and it will be my privilege to host you at Odir for a short lunch. And when I was a member of this assembly, I always wanted to visit Odir. So when I learned that you were all coming to Warsaw, I could not resist the temptation to bring you all there, not just for my personal pleasure, but really to be able to meet some of our experts and to learn more about the work that we do. And it would be my hope that as you go back home, you can bring with you a better understanding of the work that ODIHR does, and maybe also the desire to keep the issues of human rights and democracy within the OSCE area at the center of your national agenda. Ladies and gentlemen, for doing all of these, this is not an easy task in the moment that we are facing. Since last February, our region, and indeed the entire world, has been shaken by the military attack by the Russian Federation in Ukraine and by the immense humanitarian crisis that it has provoked. The impact of the hostilities has been devastating, and the loss of many civilian lives now must stop and leave space for a resolution of the conflict that can restore security. At the same time, the situation is dire not only in Ukraine, because we see flare-ups of other conflicts also in other parts of our region, which have also resulted in the loss of lives and in the lasting traumas which are provoked by wars. In this regard, it is very important, and let me be very clear on this occasion, that every part to any conflict must ensure the protection of civilians and the respect of international humanitarian law while seeking peaceful solutions to conflicts. In this context, also ensuring accountability for those who are responsible for human rights violations must be ensured, and as I recently mentioned in a presentation that I did to the Permanent Council in Vienna, peace is not only achieved by the absence of war. Peace is only achieved when human rights, starting with the right to life and the right to justice, are respected for and by all. And this is something that we need to continue to remind all of our governments. And in this sense, I wish to commend the Parliamentary Assembly, and you personally also, Mr. Lopakta, because you have been also promoting this dialogue on security crisis, especially in the context of Ukraine, always highlighting that when there is a conflict, there is a price that is paid in human lives. And this we cannot forget. So the topic of our discussion today has been at the top of our work since the start of the war in Ukraine. ODIHR has been monitoring the impact of the war since the very first day, and we have put in place a number of concrete programmatic responses. First, we have launched a Ukraine monitoring initiative, and through this we have been documenting the most egregious violations of human rights with monitors who have been deployed both in Ukraine and in the neighboring countries. Since February, we have conducted over 120 in-depth interviews of witnesses and victims of these potential human rights violations. The first report was published last July. I think it was sent to all the delegation by my office, but it's still also available on our website. And the main finding, I would just mention the main finding of this report, is that we found credible evidence of a general disregard by the Russian Federation of the rules on the conduct of hostilities that could amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. At the same time, we also found indication then, to a more limited extent, also the Ukrainian armed forces failed to comply with specific rules under international law on the conduct of hostilities. A second report will be published, and now the plan is to do it in the next month, in the month of December. Beside the documentation, we have also strengthened our cooperation, our work on accountability, supporting both national and international efforts in this regard. In this sense, we have been working closely and following the initiatives of the International Criminal Court. We have been coordinating in our documentation with the UN Special Commission on Human Rights on Ukraine, but we have also assisted Ukraine at the national level, in particular the Supreme Court and the prosecutor, the Office of the Prosecutor General, putting them in touch with the expertise of other international organizations and experiences which have been conducted in the field of prosecution of these type of crimes, in particular with representatives of the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. In addition to the documentation and accountability, we have been continuing to work on urgent issues such as the prevention of human rights trafficking, the integration of migrants and refugees, and in particular, we have a special project here in Poland, where, as you know, there is a high number of Ukrainian refugees, and we are working with municipalities to make sure that there is dialogue and cooperation among the new immigrant communities and the local population. And we have been following closely also the question of hate crimes. This is something I would like to bring to your attention, because whenever there is a conflict, the impact of the conflict is not only on the battlefield. The impact of the conflict affects the societies that are involved. And across the OSCE region, we have seen an increase of hate crimes as a result of the war in Ukraine, which has led to a higher number of hate crimes, both anti-Ukrainian hate crimes, but also anti-Russian hate crimes. And I think we need to be very careful and monitor this development closely. Ladies and gentlemen, based on this work, for today's discussion, I would like now to focus on three main human rights areas which most commonly are violated in situations of armed conflict and that have emerged directly from our monitoring work in Ukraine. First, the right to life, integrity, and dignity. Since the beginning of the war, the loss of civilian lives in Ukraine has been staggering. The President, I will not repeat, the Chairman has already mentioned the number. As of November 20th, around 17,000 civilian casualties, 6,500 civilian deaths. The expectations is that this number do not capture the reality on the ground and will be probably much higher. Additionally, millions of refugees have been forced to leave their homes, either going abroad or being internally displaced. Unfortunately, even if international humanitarian law strictly prohibits the targeting of civilians during a conflict, what we are seeing is that the main cause of the loss of civilian life in Ukraine, whether it was deliberate or incidental, stems from military operations. According to our first interim report, such incidents took place in Mariupol, Kharkiv, Izium, Borodyanka, Chernihiv, and Mykolaiv, where the shelling of residential neighborhoods using highly inaccurate weapons led to the death of many civilians, potentially hundreds. Second, I would like to highlight the right to liberty and security during armed conflict. Unfortunately, the practice of arbitrary arrests and detentions are widespread during armed conflict, and we have documented this practice in Ukraine, especially in the territories occupied by the Russian Federation. Among the victims are local authorities, human rights defenders, volunteers, and others. Third is the risk of torture and ill treatment. As we know, this is a risk that affects everyone who's kept in detention, even not during armed conflict. But during armed conflict, the risk is even greater. And in the case of Ukraine, this has affected both civilians but also prisoners of war. We have documented chilling accounts of civilian victims undergoing long interrogation sessions where they have been subjected to threats, intimidation, torture, and other abuses, including, in some cases, sexual violence. In the case of prisoners of war, we have seen reports and documented that both sides have been also responsible for the violations of the rights of prisoners of war while they were being detained. So it is my hope that these remarks will help in our discussion try to advance and to improve the respect of human rights while we are facing a tragic moment in our history. At the same time, wars also bring other dangers, and we must resist the temptation to choose authoritarian rule to try to solve the challenges of our time. And instead, we must continue to believe that sharing power, building democratic and accountable institutions, and ensuring the respect for human rights is in the interest of all of us. In conclusion, I look forward to continue working closely with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly as we continue to jointly advocate for security in our region. A security can only be achieved when human rights, democratic elections, tolerance, rule of law, and equality are respected and not violated in our region. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Matteo, thank you very much for your holistic contribution. It is good to know that we have such a strong partner in your office, because, as you mentioned it, we are facing a big humanitarian crisis, and we live in another world since February this year, and we have to find the right answers, which is not always easy. So, Poland is one of the countries, maybe the country with the biggest support for the people of Ukraine. So it is good to have you, Radoslav, with us, chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Sejm. You started your political career on the city level in your hometown, Radom, and then in the regional Parliamentary Assembly of Masovia, and you served also as international secretary of your party. And now you will have the floor to inform us how Poland, as a neighbor of Ukraine and as a strong supporter of Ukraine, is seeing the situation, and how is your point of view what we should do. Please, Radoslav.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, dear members of Parliament, dear guests. It is true indeed that unfortunately we in Poland can observe the enormous humanitarian crisis that is ongoing in Ukraine firsthand. But I think the crisis is of that size that the Russian aggression against Ukraine inevitably has driven our attention to the human dimension of the armed conflicts, hence our debate today. War crimes against humanity, suffering of the civilian population has forced us to rethink these events from the perspective of international human rights. I will try to concentrate on the concept of human rights, their evolution, as well as on the impact of armed conflict on the very concept of human rights and upholding human rights. History of Europe is full of armed conflicts. We are in a country that doesn't need to be reminded of that, and I'm pretty sure many of you share the same experience throughout the ages. European nations have participated in various armed conflicts which have shaped the history of our continent. Each armed conflict has had dire consequences for the civilian populations. Each generation of Europeans often experienced bloodshed or has seen refugees fleeing the conflict zones. Even though such terrible consequences of war have been widespread, we had to wait till the Second World War to experience a deep and profound change in the way we perceived armed conflicts and their influence on civilian population. The first milestone of this new approach towards armed conflicts was the creation of the concept of human rights that started to evolve after the Second World War. The Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 is the best example of this new approach. The concept of genocide and crimes against humanity have forever affected our perspective. This was truly a revolutionary development, since the human rights quickly became the major factor in international politics. Public opinion of the democratic countries has learned to demand that the politicians respect human rights. It quickly turned out that the concept of human rights was not sufficient, since the important part of European population lived behind the Iron Curtain. This has led to another major development of human rights concept, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and the Helsinki Accords of 1975. The signatories of Helsinki Accords included the countries of former Eastern Bloc. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seemed that the concept of human rights would spread worldwide. After all the countries of the former Warsaw Pact were all signatories of the Accords, and the European population believed that war crimes were only the memories of past nightmares that should never happen again. Moreover, in 1992 Helsinki document, OSCE participating states have committed to respect and ensure respect for international humanitarian law, including the protection of the civilian population in all circumstances, including armed conflicts. The states also declared that those who violate international humanitarian law are held personally accountable. Dear distinguished guests, we all know Francis Fukuyama, a famous American philosopher, who believed that the fall of the Soviet Union has marked the new era. He called it the end of history. Many hoped this would be the case. The history of the world was supposed to go into the right direction, which is characterized by the development of democracy, free market economy, and human rights. The theories of Fukuyama were quickly put to test, since armed conflicts unfortunately have come back. However, the armed conflicts in former Yugoslavia seemed to uplift the spirits of all human rights advocates, because the perpetrators of war crimes were brought to justice. The trial of Slobodan Milošević and Ratko Mladić serve as the best examples that we have learned from our past mistakes. The end of history has never seemed to be closer. It must be mentioned, however, that now, 30 years after the end of conflict in Yugoslavia, we are no longer so optimistic. And we cannot be optimistic, unfortunately. The Russian aggression against Ukraine has been accompanied by human rights violation on unprecedented scale. The destruction of Ukrainian cities, sexual violence, unlawful detention in inhuman condition, forced deportation, that all have put an issue of bringing the perpetrators to justice on top of our to-do list. In other words, the question that we are now facing is, can we ensure that the human rights are observed if the violators of these rights, including war criminals, are protected by an aggressive imperialist power that happens to be one of the signatories of the Helsinki Accords. How can we solve this paradox? This is the issue of the utmost importance, because if we let Russian war criminals get away with these terrible crimes, this will mean that the very concept of human rights is deeply flawed and has no direct impact on the fate of victims of war crimes. If we are unable to prosecute monsters that have slaughtered the civilians in Bucha or Mariupol, we must be able to face the fact that human rights cease to exist during the time of war. Inter arma silent leges. During the war, the laws are silent, that is, they are no longer in force. This phrase that is attributed to ancient Roman lawyer Cicero is the perfect description of the country at war with no human rights in place. In the light of this consideration, it must be underlined that the consequences of the aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine shed new light on practical aspects on the comprehensive concept of security that was developed in the OSCE. There is no international security without human rights that have to be respected both internally and externally. Cooperation among the states at the international level toward the protection of human rights, fundamental freedoms and democracy are central components of the OSCE comprehensive concept of security. OSCE closely cooperates with human rights organizations with the purpose of monitoring and documenting war atrocities. When talking about monitoring and documenting those atrocities and human rights violations committed in the context of armed conflicts, a particular focus should be given to the civil society and their immense activity. Their tireless work undertaken on the ground, often putting them at a myriad of risks, deserve our utmost respect. When compared to other international organizations, OSCE provides civil society organizations with a number of fora to present their work and share their concerns, mostly during the Human Dimension meetings or human rights-focused conferences, such as this year's Warsaw Human Dimension Conference convoked by the Polish chairmanship in office. In this context, all actions undertaken by international organizations, including the OSCE, to ensure such accountability are of a pivotal nature. They include establishment of dedicated mechanisms, for instance, the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, continued monitoring by existing bodies, such as United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, and new or enhanced monitoring activities, as mentioned before, ODIHR's initiative in Ukraine or activity by OSCE representative on freedom of media. Last but not least, they also involve effective multilateral cooperation undertaken in all relevant international organizations according to their mandates and in line with their particular experience. Dear members of parliaments, we must face the fact that our area, the OSCE region, is now facing a big security threat. A threat that is stemming from the unprovoked and unjustified Russian military aggression against Ukraine, accompanied by a huge humanitarian and human rights crisis caused by the aggressor. The impact of Russian invasion on Ukraine and the Ukrainian population, their right to life, health, and education, is devastating. It will continue to affect the situation of civilians in Ukraine for coming months, if not years. There are tens of thousands of Ukrainian children that are attending classes in Poland schools, just because they cannot do it in Ukraine, just because the schools in Ukraine need bomb shelters to protect those most vulnerable. Having said that, I hope that the war in Ukraine will only strengthen our efforts to fully observe the human rights during the times of armed conflict. Recent Russian war crimes have only emphasized the importance of the concept of human rights during armed conflicts, and the suffering of the civilian population of Ukraine must not only lead to prosecution of war crimes, but also to a creation of a mechanism of protection of human rights in times of armed conflicts. Let us hope that such new mechanisms will help us to build a better world, where a violation of the human rights will cease to be an experience of generations of Europeans, but will only remain a story, a nightmare that we read about during the history lessons. Thank you very much for all your attention.
Radoslav, thank you for your contribution. Colleagues, I now look forward to hearing from you. I have already noted 33 names on our speakers list, but would encourage you to come up as soon as possible and let us know if you wish to intervene, because then we have to close the list. Yesterday we had 2 minutes. Today we start with 3 minutes, but 3 minutes is the absolute limit, so please respect it. The first speaker is Amina Akazadeh from Azerbaijan, then Daniela Terida from Germany, and Kyriakos from Cyprus. So please, Amina.
Dear colleagues, the world we live in is currently going through a very difficult time. Large-scale conflicts in Europe for the first time after the Second World War, energy, food, and other crises covering the world are a clear proof of this. I would like to take this opportunity to bring to the attention of our colleagues my views on the latest geopolitical events happening in the region I represent. The trilateral statement of 10th November 2020 has put an end to the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan and set agreed parameters for establishing durable peace in the region. Now that the war is over and the conflict has been resolved, the absolute priority of Azerbaijan is sustaining and consolidating fragile peace emerged with the signing of the trilateral statement. To this end, it's essential to implement effective post-conflict rehabilitation, reconstruction, and reintegration activities. The government of Azerbaijan has already initiated practical steps aiming at eliminating the consequences, including humanitarian implication of the decades-old occupation of the territories of Azerbaijan by Armenia, accompanied by massive destruction. Large-scale construction work is carried out in the liberated territories, which is being conducted with Azerbaijan's own financial resources. The government of Azerbaijan has launched a plan to begin returning the displaced persons safely and securely to the liberated territories. Unfortunately, the high scale of contamination by landmines prevents the return of IDPs in safety and dignity to their homes. We look forward to the return of about 1 million of IDPs and celebrating the start of new chapter for Karabakh. Smart village of Agali in Zangilan district has already welcomed 50 IDPs families recently. In September, the first bell rang in the village secondary school after 29 years. We can assuredly say that the life has returned to these areas. Another track of the post-conflict reconstruction process is focused on restoration of cultural heritage in the liberated territories. During the occupation period, the historical and cultural features have been changed and the sign of Azerbaijani cultural and historical roots have been removed. For decades, Azerbaijan had been appealing to the international community, including UNESCO, to visit the occupied territory and to assess the scale of unprecedented destruction, vandalism, and looting inflicted upon cultural heritage to no avail. However, deployment of a UNESCO technical mission to the region is being hindered by one particular participating state due to its own political interests. Another humanitarian challenge emerged from the former conflict is the issues of the whereabouts of around 4,000 Azerbaijanis whose fate remains unknown, elaborating on the need to address wrongdoing and establish accountability for advancing sustainable peace building and reconciliation with particular focus on post-conflict situation is essential. Thank you for your attention.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank, lieber Herr Vizepräsident Lopatka, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen. Als Sonderbeauftragte für Osteuropa verurteile ich Russlands Angriffskrieg auf das Schärfste. Er ist ein fundamentaler Angriff auf die Menschenrechte und Grundfreiheiten des ukrainischen Volkes. Russland greift zielgerichtet die zivilen Infrastrukturen an und angesichts der Misserfolge der russischen Armee richtet Präsident Putin seinen Krieg nun zunehmend gegen die Zivilbevölkerung. Das ist besonders verwerflich und die Zahl der getöteten Zivilistinnen und Zivilisten steigt nämlich jeden Tag und unter diesen Getöteten sind auch enorm viele Kinder. Das schmerzt uns ganz besonders. Mehr als 14 Millionen Menschen sind bereits auf der Flucht und es gibt auch zahlreiche Berichte, wir haben es eben noch mal gehört, über Verstöße gegen das humanitäre Kriegsvölkerrecht. Massenexekutionen im Schnellverfahren, Vergewaltigungen, Folter, Plünderungen und Brandschatzung und all dies nach dem Prinzip der verbrannten Erde. Verbrechen gegen die Menschlichkeit und Kriegsverbrechen, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, müssen hart bestraft werden. Denn Straflosigkeit ermuntert nur die Täter zu weiteren Verbrechen. Und deshalb rufe ich uns als Mitglieder der Parlamentarischen Versammlung hier und heute dazu auf, die Strafermittlungen des Internationalen Strafgerichtshofs zu unterstützen und sich für eigene Strafermittlungen in den OSZE-Teilnehmerstaaten nach dem Prinzip des Weltrechtsprinzips stark zu machen. 2 frühere Mitarbeiter der speziellen Beobachtungsmission der OSZE wurden wegen der Ausübung ihrer dienstlichen Tätigkeiten von den illegitimen Autoritäten in den besetzten Gebieten im Übrigen zu Haftstrafen verurteilt. Sie müssen sofort freigelassen werden und das muss eine Forderung sein, die auch heute hier erhoben wird. Die Einhaltung der menschenrechtlichen Verpflichtungen nämlich durch die Kriegsparteien muss lückenlos überwacht werden und hierfür haben wir auch den Moskauer Mechanismus, den wir dafür intensiv nutzen wollten. Lasse mich deshalb an dieser Stelle auch noch mal ganz herzlich dem ODIHR-Direktor Matteo Mecacci herzlich für seinen Einsatz danken. Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Russlands Krieg gegen die Ukraine bedroht aber zudem auch die Ernährungssicherheit der Weltbevölkerung. Es ist schärfstens zu verurteilen, dass Russland Hunger als Waffe gegen die ukrainische Zivilbevölkerung einsetzt. Und es ist völlig inakzeptabel, dass das Nahrungsmittelangebot auf dem Weltmarkt verknappt wird, um mit den gestiegenen Preisen politische Interessen durchzusetzen. Und deshalb gilt mein Dank all jenen, die die Vertragsverlängerung für das Getreideabkommen ermöglicht haben. Es ist allerdings auch unerlässlich, Fragen der globalen Ernährungssicherheit in die Sicherheitsarchitektur der OSZE und ihrer Parlamentarischen Versammlung zu integrieren. Dies ist ein elementarer Bestandteil der wirtschaftlichen und ökologischen Sicherheit. Ohne Dialog, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ohne Diplomatie und Interessensausgleich können Konflikte nicht gelöst werden und kann der Frieden nicht dauerhaft gesichert werden. Sie hören, dafür kämpfe ich leidenschaftlich. Vielen Dank.
Danke, vielen Dank, Kollegin Daniela De Rida. Der nächste Sprecher aus the next speaker from Cyprus, Kyriakos.
Vielen Dank, Herr Präsident. So the consequences of the Russian war against Ukraine are enormous and devastating. Death, violence, and uprooting of millions of people damage civilian infrastructure, and particularly the destruction of the country's energy grid is making a humanitarian disaster all the more possible as winter approaches. The sanctions imposed on Russia have resulted in a massive global economic and food crisis with consequences in many countries in our region. Our primary goal is to support the Ukrainian people who are experiencing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. As members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, we must optimize the unique tool that is parliamentary diplomacy to promote dialogue, to end hostilities, to open new humanitarian corridors, to evacuate civilians, to investigate the fate of missing persons, and to facilitate the exchange of prisoners and the continuing flow of humanitarian aid. Worrying reports on massive burial of civilians must be thoroughly investigated. As per the recent UN General Assembly resolution, perpetrators of any violations of international law, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law must be held to account. An international mechanism must be established for reparation for damages, loss or injury arising from international wrongful acts carried out in Ukraine. As the biggest refugees crisis continues unabated, the displacement of millions of people and the exposure of the most vulnerable among them to all kinds of dangers and abuses require immediate, drastic, and collective solutions. Moreover, neighboring host countries should have continued support in terms of resources and infrastructure in order to be able to better receive Ukrainian refugees. In this respect, civil society organizations offer substantial added value in the field of the human dimension, since they are active in promoting fundamental rights and in strengthening democratic processes and the rule of law. Cyprus, for its part, despite the difficult situation it is facing being the EU member states with the highest number of asylum seekers compared to its population, has welcomed more than 20,000 Ukrainian refugees since last February and has provided them all the benefits including access to housing, healthcare, and education in line with the EU Temporary Protection Directive. We need to disconnect the humanitarian aspect from the political aspect of this conflict. Only so we can help the people on the place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kyriakos. The next three speakers, Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine, Kamil Aydin from Turkey, and Renata Alt from Germany. Pavlo, please.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, absolute majority of us speak true and correct words about the protection of fundamental human rights and freedoms. How to ensure that statements, resolutions, and declarations are not empty, but correspond to reality. For this, words need to be supported by actions and responsibility for not keeping the words. Since the beginning of 2014, Russia, its troops and supporters have committed a number of heinous crimes in the territory of Ukraine. All these crimes must be investigated and the guilty brought to justice. Today, we observe the unprecedented participation of other states in the investigation of crimes committed on Ukraine. The activities of a joint investigative group, the involvement of International Criminal Court, we are confident that we will bring to justice those involved in the commission of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crimes of genocide as soon as possible. However, the ICC has no authority to investigate the crime of aggression against Ukraine. That's why we initiated the establishment of a mechanism that will be able to investigate and prosecute the highest political and military leadership of the Russian Federation for committing the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Such a mechanism is the special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. We also hope that the OSCE, national governments and parliaments of member states will actively contribute to the establishment of the special tribunal. And now about the main things. At this autumn session dedicated to the war in Ukraine, the decision of the Standing Committee on amendments to the Assembly's Rule of Procedure on the possibility of suspending the rights of a delegation of member states in case of a military attack against another state will be the most important for preserving the authority of our organization in the world. This decision is required by the principles of the Helsinki Final Act and the values of our voters, who have the right to demand this. A failure of the vote will mean that our Assembly will oppose itself to democratic values and indulge further violations of human rights and freedoms by authoritarian regimes. There can be no security and cooperation with terrorists and war criminals. The question of the future of such an organization and the need for its reboot will become quite likely. After all, what is the point of spending taxpayers' money on the activities of an organization that is unable to force its members to adhere of the fundamental rules on which it was created? Every member of the Standing Committee who tries today to block the decision on the possibility of suspending the membership, the right of the aggressor state, will go down in world history as an accomplice of bloody dictator, a terrorist, and the murder of innocent children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kamil, please.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, the war launched by the Russian Federation against Ukraine constitutes a serious violation of international law. This aggression continues to cause death and devastation across Ukraine, causing immense humanitarian tragedy. Unfortunately, the civilians continue to bear the brunt of this war, and children have become the victims of the full spectrum of human rights violations. According to the UN Resident Coordinator for Ukraine, almost 18 million people need humanitarian assistance, while around 14 million have been forced to flee their homes. We also have to remember 6.2 million internally displaced and nearly 7.7 million refugees. There is no question that this aggression must stop. Human lives must be saved. We are also disturbed about the ongoing human rights violations and intimidation campaign against the Crimean Tatars. Politically motivated prison sentences against Deputy Speaker of the Crimean Tatar Mejlis, Neriman Celal, as well as Hasan Ahmedov and Aziz Ahmedov, and the others concerning. We reiterate our support to Crimean Tatars' right to live freely and safely in their homelands, and expect the immediate release of Crimean Tatars who were imprisoned in Crimea. Dear Chairperson, when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, we believe that the activities of the relevant human dimension institutions and bodies of the OSCE have been important to raise awareness regarding the needs of the refugees and to fight against human trafficking. On our part, our humanitarian assistance to Ukraine will also continue unabatedly. We are trying to provide all kinds of assistance to citizens of Ukraine, including Ukrainian orphans who fled the war and took refuge in our country. We also closely cooperate with the UN and other international organizations to alleviate the humanitarian situation. Devastated cities, infrastructure, or anything material can be repaired, rebuilt somehow. There will be, however, no cure for the pain and suffering that the people of Ukraine currently endure. Longer the ongoing crisis continues, harder the prospect for peace will become. This is why we repeat on numerous occasions the need for a negotiated, fair, and lasting peace through diplomacy. There will be no winners in this war. We will continue our goodwill efforts to contribute for the revival of the negotiation process. When and if requested by the sides, Turkey is ready to provide its support to this end. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Kamil. Renata Alt from Germany is the next.
Sehr geehrter Herr Vizepräsident, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, seit 9 Monaten begehen die russischen Truppen gröbste Menschenrechts- und Völkerrechtsverletzungen in der Ukraine. Vergewaltigungen, verschwinden lassen, Folter und Massaker, das Grauen hat dort mittlerweile ein System. 11 Folterstätten, 63 Tote mit Folterspuren, mehr als 430 Untersuchungen wegen Kriegsverbrechen. Das ist nur eine vorläufige Bilanz in der Region Cherson, die gerade eben vor einigen Tagen von den ukrainischen Soldaten zurückerobert wurde. Uns stellt sich die drängende Frage, wie Menschenrechte und Freiheit in bewaffneten Konflikten und humanitären Krisen geschützt werden können. Ein wichtiger Schritt, um die Menschenrechte zu schützen, ist deshalb eine effektive Aufklärung und Verfolgung von Menschenrechtsverletzungen. Deshalb ist aktuell die Arbeit der Forensiker so wichtig. Satellitendaten müssen zur Verfügung gestellt werden. Um unseren Verpflichtungen zu Menschenrechten und Demokratie gerecht zu werden, muss für uns die Aufklärung als Priorität gelten. Wir müssen die Ukraine mit allen Mitteln, die uns zur Verfügung stehen, unterstützen. Das neue Supportprogramm für Ukraine der OSCE ist ein wichtiger Schritt. Es muss auch weiterhin unser Anspruch sein, eine lückenlose, rigorose Aufarbeitung und strafrechtliche Verfolgung zu ermöglichen. Für viele dieser Verbrechen, beispielsweise dem Verschwindenlassen, ist es unmöglich, eine genaue Zahl der Betroffenen zu nennen. Es gibt mittlerweile Zahlen, dass mehr als 7.000 ukrainische Kinder zur Zwangsadoption in Russland angeboten wurden. Jeder Vater hier im Raum, jede Mutter hier im Saal, die eigene Kinder hat, kann sich vorstellen, was für Qualen es sind, wenn ein eigenes Kind einem weggenommen wird, seine Geburtsurkunden, alle Dokumente vernichtet werden und dieses Kind unter einem anderen Namen zur Adoption in Russland angeboten wird. Diese Kinder werden möglicherweise nie mehr eigene Eltern sehen. Es gibt zahlreiche NGOs, die in den betroffenen Gebieten Beweise jetzt sichern und Großartiges leisten. Deutschland unterstützt diese NGOs durch Expertise und finanzielle Mittel. Nur das kann jedoch nur der Anfang sein. Die Verantwortlichen für die menschenverachtenden Taten müssen sich vor einem Strafgericht verantworten. Die internationale Gemeinschaft und Gremien wie auch die PV-OSZE müssen die internationale Strafverteidigung von Kriegsverbrechen forcieren. Jedes Kriegsverbrechen muss bestraft werden. Das muss unser Anspruch sein für die Freiheit und für die Menschenrechte.
Vielen Dank. The next 3 speakers are Hedi Fry from Canada, Vadim Halechuk from Ukraine, and Nizami Safarov from Azerbaijan. Hedi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I want to welcome Matteo Mecacci back to this assembly. We've missed him. Now, I just wanted to suggest that while we're going to speak about war, we need to recognize that violations of human rights occur in peacetime in many nation states. And so let us recall that. But I wanted to focus on war, and I wanted, as a gender representative, to focus on the impacts of war on gender. Women are, in fact, the greatest victims of war. Women, we know 90% of migrants forced to flee this war are women. We know that about 265,000 of them are currently pregnant. The bottom line is, are they able to access good prenatal care? Do they have food insecurity? We know that international food aid isn't reaching all of their needs because you have specific food needs when you're pregnant. How do they get to delivery? How do they get to postpartum care? How do they get to prenatal care? Those are the questions we need to ask. But the more important thing to remember is that Women do the bulk of the unpaid work. They are responsible for caring for the children, they are fleeing homes, they are responsible for caring of the family, including the children and even parents. So women are bearing the burden of this. But more importantly, we know that during war, women are more prone to having exploitation, to sexual violence, to violence of every kind, that they are actually, rape has become a tactic of war. We know that many of these women are being raped. Now, do they have access to abortion, safe abortion? Do they have access to any of their sexual and reproductive rights? Those are questions we need to ask. And one of the things that we need to talk about is how we document this as nation states. We need to document it. We need to do gender sex aggregated data to document these crimes against women. And we need to be able to talk about how we take these criminals to justice at international criminal courts and how we get compensation for the crimes against them. I just wanted to remind everyone that the need of women in these situations to mental health because of their post-traumatic stress disorder is also a great need that we need to consider. But I want to remind everybody that in 1995, the world suddenly agreed that women's rights were human rights. Well, we still have not achieved this actualization of women's rights being seen as human rights. And I want us to all in this assembly to document, to take care, to make sure that women are in fact helped to get mental health and to be able to deal with the impacts of this war on women particularly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution and your long-lasting support for the work of OSCE PA. Vadim Halachuk from Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Distinguished colleagues, thank you for all the support and the comments that you have been making here. The reality is such that Russia turned the sovereign territory of Ukraine into a scene of the most heinous crimes in modern history. The missile terror remains the part and parcel of Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine from the first days. And unfortunately, the Kremlin now has made it an official policy that residential areas, schools, kindergartens, medical facilities, you name it, have all of a sudden become, in their words, legitimate military targets. Number of civilian casualties is shocking, and it's rising every day. Even in the official numbers, the number of civilian casualties now is over 16,000 in total. Of them, around 7,000 killed and 10,000 injured. But we understand that the numbers are much, much higher. We even cannot begin to estimate what happened, for example, in Mariupol, where the city was just leveled with air bombardments and attacks. Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, Izum, Liman, Kherson, all these regions are now becoming more and more accessible to both Ukrainian and international investigators who discover awful evidence of Russian crimes there. 90 years ago, around this time, back in 32 and 33, Stalin and his totalitarian regime tried to starve millions of Ukrainians to death during the Holodomor genocide. We call on all OSCE PA member states and their national parliaments to recognize Holodomor of 1932 and 33 in Ukraine as crime of genocide against the Ukrainian people, and we're grateful to those who already have done so, and there's a number of such parliaments in such countries. These atrocities are all accompanied by great campaign of disinformation and propaganda in Russia. And unfortunately, that campaign is also very active here in Europe and in the territories of different countries of PA OSCE. Ukraine views, together with international partners and civil society, this task of collecting evidence is very important in order for the future to hold Russia responsible. We welcome that in July, back in July in 2022, the Assembly supported the idea of creation of special international criminal tribunal for the crime of aggression, because as we understand, the crime of aggression is what investigators call the mother of all crimes. So we will be grateful for the support in your national parliaments. It is crucially important that we continue monitoring situation of Ukraine and exchanges this information. Ukraine's been very open. Investigators have been invited by law enforcement and prosecutors in Ukraine to come and see with their own eyes and use their tools and experience to collect the necessary evidence. Together we will bring the perpetrators to justice. Thank you all.
Thank you, Vadim. The next speaker, Nisami Safarov from Azerbaijan.
Господин председатель, дамы и господа, самый серьезный вооруженный конфликт на европейском континенте со времен Второй мировой войны отчетливо продемонстрировал фундаментальную важность защиты индивидуальных прав в условиях военного противостояния и разразившегося гуманитарного кризиса. В нашем регионе ряд нерешенных проблем, связанных с продолжающимся систематическим нарушением норм международного гуманитарного права и международного права прав человека, является препятствием для постконфликтного урегулирования. Более 1 миллиона мин, размещенных армянскими вооруженными силами, продолжают и сегодня уносить жизни, несмотря на окончание войны. Хотя на сегодняшний день в Азербайджане от мин очищено 50 тысяч гектаров, тем не менее, после подписания трехстороннего заявления от 10 ноября 2020 года на освобожденных территориях погибли 267 человек, многие получили тяжелые увечья из-за разрыва мин, произведенных в 2021 году на территории Армении. Карты минных полей, переданные Армении, лишь на 25% оказались соответствующими действительности. Эти действия нарушают фундаментальные принципы международного гуманитарного права, принцип проведения различия и принцип пропорциональности, имеющие статус нормы международного обычного права. Проблема военнопленных, заложников и лиц, пропавших без вести, является чрезвычайно чувствительной для азербайджанской стороны, поскольку еще со времен Первой Карабахской войны ничего не известно о судьбе почти 4000 человек, среди которых 267 женщин, 71 ребенок, 326 лиц пожилого возраста. Не имеется информации и о судьбе 6 пропавших без вести в период 44-дневной войны. Отказываясь давать информацию о лицах, пропавших без вести, армянская сторона стремится скрыть следы таких преступлений против человечности, как обращение в сексуальное рабство, насильственное исчезновение людей, пытки, пытается уклониться от ответственности за военные преступления, включающие в себя захват заложников и убийство комбатантов. Тем самым Республика Армения нарушает свои международные обязательства по Женевским конвенциям о защите жертв вооруженных конфликтов и первому дополнительному протоколу, к которому она присоединилась в июне 1993 года. 4 Женевские конвенции предусматривают, что в ситуациях международных вооруженных конфликтов стороны должны принимать все возможные меры для выяснения участи и установления местонахождения пропавших без вести, а также розыска, извлечения и опознания останков. Обнаружение массовых захоронений на освобожденных азербайджанских территориях в Кельбаджарском и Хаджавенском районах является лишь небольшой демонстрацией систематического уничтожения лиц из числа гражданского населения и военнопленных, наглядно показывающих реальные масштабы совершения международных преступлений, вызывающих озабоченных международного сообщества в целом. Подобные действия не могут оставаться безнаказанными. Благодарю.
Thank you very much. The next 3 speakers are David Stöckmüller from Austria, Vilija Alknaite Paramikiene from Lithuania, and Gabor Haidu from Romania. David.
Thanks, dear Chair, dear colleagues. What was until recently unimaginable for many Europeans, especially among the young generation, has now become fact. Putin's unlawful invasion of Ukraine has changed the global political forever and has caused massive suffering among the Ukrainian people, with thousands forced to leave their homes and thousands more not lucky enough to escape. It is only thanks to the incredible strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people that we are still talking of an invasion 9 months later and not on an occupation. So war has returned to Europe, and with it, question of ensuring and protecting fundamental rights enduring armed conflicts have moved closer to home. As with so many armed conflicts, the younger generation are the ones that suffer the most. It is they who are suddenly asked to drop everything and defend the motherland. It is they who make up the bulk of the wartime casualties. And it's also the younger generation whose future, with dreams and prospects, were suddenly and irrecoverably shattered by Putin's tanks. This goes, of course, for the brave scores of young Ukrainians who have taken up arms in the last 9 months. But this is a reality that younger generation in Russia shares too, who from one day to the next were forced to relieve the exhausted and demoralized troops that entered Ukraine's sovereign territory on February 24th. When it comes to protect the rights and freedom of these young people, it should not matter if they are Ukrainians or Syrians or Afghans or Armenians. But I think many of my colleagues will agree with me that these issues feel fundamentally more real when they are a few thousand or a few hundred kilometers from their own families and loved ones. There are many lessons to learn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and this should be one of them. If fundamental rights and freedoms are as universal as we claim them to be, we must uphold them always and for everyone, not just when it directly affects us. While the world is focused on the fighting in Ukraine, sparks of conflicts are once again flying in Turkey. In Iran, brave young people have been taking to the streets and facing lesser violences for weeks just to lay claim to the fraction of the rights we take for granted. We must not forget the universality of these rights, and we must not get tired of fighting for them, dear colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, David. The next one is Vilia. I can write the...
Thank you, dear Chairman. History has not come to an end, dear colleagues, and we live in tragic historic times. During this session, we are taking a political and moral test. Our credibility and the credibility of the whole organization depends on how we pass this test. Impunity for aggression, especially by a state so large and on such a scale, will encourage it to continue war and crimes against humanity. What is more important is it will encourage other dictators and non-democratic regimes to pursue their policies by brutal force. Russia has been violating all its obligations for a long time. During the First and Second Chechen wars, wars against Georgia in 2008 and against Ukraine in 2014. The reaction of international community, including the OSCE, was quite weak and sometimes naive because we failed in naming things their real names. It was probably hoped that by making concessions to Russia, its imperial ambitions would fade. Unfortunately, a few decades ago, the Srebrenica massacre shocked the European consciences. Today, we are discovering hundreds of Srebrenicas in Ukraine. In the territories liberated by Ukrainian troops, there are always signs of horrible crimes, mass graves of civilians, torture chambers, raped women and children. This is partly because the world has failed to react properly to the mass graves in Chechnya in 1994. If we do not react properly today, if we do not stand on the side of the victims of Russian terrorism and on the side of the truth, these graves may well appear in our own countries. Therefore, the least we can do is to adopt the amendments to our statute that the plenary in Birmingham decided to adopt in one or another way. Let us make the contribution to justice and to preserving the foundations of the OSCE as an organization with our action. Otherwise, people could repeat the words of Hamlet of Shakespeare. Something is rotten in this organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabor Haidu is the next from Romania.
Dankeschön, Herr Präsident. Dear colleagues, it is an honor to address you today on the issue on protecting fundamental human rights and freedoms. Romania attaches great importance to the OSCE third dimension that deals with these aspects. We express appreciation to the Polish chair and ODIHR for the holding of the Warsaw Human Dimension Conference in September this year. Since Russia continued to misuse the consensus rule in order to block the organizing of this event, we appreciate that the conference could be organized as a chairmanship event. It was a valuable opportunity for an exchange with civil society, and the topics of the event were marked by the illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. We continue to value ODIHR's work on a variety of topics, such as ensuring the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary, respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms, strengthening democratic institutions, increasing political participation of women and persons in vulnerable situations, such as Roma. We also continue to value ODIHR's unique expertise on election observation. It is our belief that ODIHR is playing a key role in the current Ukraine conflict. We particularly appreciate the ODIHR Ukraine Monitoring Initiative, which was operational from day one of the aggression, and the interim report on violation of international humanitarian law and international human rights law in Ukraine, published in 2022. We also appreciate ODIHR's technical assistance to the recent expert missions deployed under the Moscow mechanism. We reiterate our vision that there must be no impunity. Perpetrators of all war crimes, crimes against humanity, and other atrocity crimes committed during this war must be held accountable. Thank you, dear colleagues.
Thank you very much, Gabor. The next three speakers, Jean-Yves Leconte from France, Eva Johanna Eloranta from Finland, and Paula Cardoso from Portugal. Jean-Yves.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Hier, le président Zelensky, la maréchale de la Diète, Madame Vitek, nos collègues de la délégation ukrainienne et beaucoup de témoignages aussi entendus ce matin nous ont rappelé les crimes commis par la Russie en Ukraine. Les viols, les tortures, les exécutions sommaires, les enlèvements d'enfants, les bombardements d'infrastructures civiles vitales, de maisons et d'hôpitaux. Mes chers collègues, nos pays offrent la protection au titre de l'asile, mais aussi de la protection temporaire, à de nombreux citoyens ukrainiens qui furent victimes de viols, d'agressions, et qui vivent chez nous, dans nos pays, avec ces traumatismes. Nos pays offrent aussi la protection et l'asile à des victimes de torture dans les geôles des régimes de M. Loukachenko, Poutine ou Aliyev. Aucun commanditaire de ces crimes, de ces tortures, aucun exécutant de ces crimes, aucun complice de ces crimes ne doit imaginer pouvoir vivre en toute impunité. La justice internationale pourra bien entendu et sera essentielle pour combattre cette immunité. La justice ukrainienne, qui travaille sur ce qui a été commis sur le territoire de l'Ukraine, le fait aussi, parfois avec notre aide, mais ne pourra pas faire face seule à la totalité des instructions de crimes qui sont malheureusement commis sur le territoire ukrainien. Mais nous, membres de parlements nationaux, nous pouvons aussi agir concrètement chez nous, dans nos pays, pour combattre ce sentiment d'impunité des coupables. Nous devons veiller à ce que dans nos pays, nos justices nationales soient compétentes pour instruire les crimes, pour identifier les auteurs et pour sanctionner ces crimes dès lors que les victimes de ces crimes vivent dans nos pays. Prenons ici tous à Varsovie l'engagement qu'en retournant dans nos pays, nous agirons pour faire en sorte que nos législations et nos pratiques puissent changer la donne et faire en sorte que nos justices soient compétentes pour protéger et instruire les crimes des victimes qui aujourd'hui vivent dans nos pays. Je crois que c'est essentiel pour accompagner l'action de la justice ukrainienne et combattre l'immunité de tous ceux qui aujourd'hui se rendent coupables de ces crimes. Je vous remercie.
Merci. The next, Eva Johanna from Finland.
Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, the OSCE is going through an existential crisis with the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Now is the time to reflect on the OSCE's added value as an international institution. I believe it is also gained through education and training projects, as well as supporting youth and civil society organizations and education, which are a critical part of building resilient societies in the OSCE region. The OSCE has an important role to play and significant know-how in this area. For example, in increasing youth media literacy to counter disinformation, a critical piece often underemphasized in many educational curricula today. OSCE competency trainings also offer creative projects for supporting societal resiliency. For example, training teachers on how history can perpetuate conflict and what methods can be used to promote peace through history education. As Russian aggression against Ukraine has shown, the use of history in attempting to advocate against another OSCE participating state's right to exist is at the forefront of contemporary politics. Understanding the political power of history is a critical skill for citizens of the OSCE region to have. In Finland, we have an international NGO, Historians Without Borders, that connects academics, policymakers, and society in large in critically assessing the role of history and in perpetuating conflict. These are the types of innovative, transnational educational organizations that we should further support on OSCE activities. Thinking about what role the OSCE can have in promoting these innovative approaches to education and civil society development and security should be one of our key goals leading up to the 2025 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. It is time to start thinking also of new ways to uphold OSCE commitments for the people we represent, especially in these unprecedented times when basic OSCE values are under threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one is Paula Cardoso from Portugal.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, today marks the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women. Violence against women is a scourge of all societies, whether they are democrats or not. Not forgetting the thousands of women who have been victims of violence in the world, our main concern today is with Ukrainian women. Women who are an example of strength in the fight against the Russian invasion of their country. Many flee with their children, parents, and pets to escape the bombardments. Others undergo military training to resist the Russian army. They have effectively shown that they have resilience, strength, and great dignity. But we must not forget that among the more than 10 million people forced from their homes since the war in Ukraine began, women and girls account for 90% of those displaced. This figure equals almost 25% of the Ukrainian population. These unaccompanied women, as well as the children and elderly who flee with them and take shelter in neighboring or other countries, are exposed to serious gender-specific risks, such as trafficking, sexual violence, and difficulty in accessing essential services and goods. The entire international community, through the voice and action of the multiple organizations that compose it, as is the case of our organization, has to be called upon to ensure priority in addressing the rights and needs of women and girls displaced by the conflict in Ukraine. Food, shelter, legal assistance, mental health support, and help for those on the run are among their greatest needs. We must join forces and be particularly attentive to the further cases of sexual abuse or violence, as well as the exploitation of women and girls in this context of war. But we cannot forget or lower our arms to the Afghan women, depriving of their rights to health and education, and to work and contribute in the national economy. The coming to power of Taliban restrict the access of female Afghan students to secondary and higher education and impose adaptations and changes to school curricula. We heard desperate reports of young Afghan women who wanted to continue studying and working. Taliban police have rapidly turned many women and girls into virtual prisoners in their homes, depriving the country of one of its most precious resources, the skills and talents of the female half of the population. Obscurantism, radicalism, and Sharia law will return. The respect for women's rights, especially those of girls and women, will return. There will be a return to the total invisibility of women. Women, those who survive, will lose their voices, their freedom, and their dignity. What actually happens is that women are currently hiding at home, burning academic diplomas and other documents of achievements that have now become their death sentence. We cannot forget the Iranian women. Our commitment must be to denounce and support the struggle of these women. Women are experiencing a setback at their rights, moments of a particular difficulty, so let us be capable of being the voice of those who do not have one and the face of those who cannot show it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. Philip Lawrence from Canada, Farah Karimi from Netherlands, and Gemma Arancho from Spain are the next three. Philip, please.
Thank you, Honorable Chair, fellow parliamentarians. I'd like to intervene in the section of the human dimension and talk about international human rights and the necessity of consequences for those who violate them. In 9 months since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has launched a systemic campaign aimed at destroying the Ukrainian state and dehumanizing the Ukrainian people. Overall, about 1/3 of Ukraine's pre-war population has been displaced. As my colleague rightfully points out, 90% of which have been women trying to get their children often to safety. This war has created a massive human rights crisis. Millions are now relying on international assistance simply to feed themselves and their families. Brutally, Russia has launched attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure, including the electrical grid, and engaged in other acts of terrorism aimed at breaking the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Indeed, millions of Ukrainians right now are in the dark without food or water. Russia's human rights violations have been well documented. In July 2022, for example, an expert report produced by this very organization, the Moscow Mechanism, revealed evidence of significant violations of international human rights and humanitarian law by Russian troops in Ukraine. Russia hopes that Ukraine will lose their resolve and that this organization will lose their resolve. Instead, the opposite must happen and is happening in Ukraine. The people of Ukraine have shown incredible resilience and courage. To my Ukrainian colleagues, I say to them, with no exaggeration, you are an inspiration to the entire world. As Churchill famously said of the Greeks, heroes will one day say they fought like Ukrainians. Those who committed human rights violations in Russia simply must be accountable for their actions. That is why the Magnitsky sanctions are so incredibly important. Of course, they are named in the honor of Sergei Magnitsky, who stood up against Russian corruption and human rights violations. We must simply not allow those individuals who have committed those horrendous acts to travel around the world attending cocktail parties as if nothing has happened. We must make sure that Russian aggression is not met with impunity. That means our parliaments of the world imposing sanctions on those violators of human rights, those corrupt officials. We must also act by suspending memberships of privileges of those who violate the most fundamental and sacrosanct principles of this organization. We must act for Ukraine. Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, Philip. Farah is the next one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like strongly support the words spoken by our Special Representative on Eastern Europe, Daniela de Rida. The discussion of this morning has shown again how important the third dimension of OSCE and the work of our third committee is. It is about people. It is about their lives, rights, and their well-beings. I would like now to draw your attention to the following. The flight MH17 with 298 passengers was shot on 17 July 2014. It departed from Amsterdam airport and it was in East Ukrainian airspace when it was hit by the Russian Buk missiles. And all passengers were instantly killed, including dozens of children. Their loved ones left behind with enormous grievance, with so many questions, why their loved ones must die, and they want to see justice. After careful and deep investigations, the court in the Netherlands has sentenced one Ukrainian separatist from Donetsk and two Russian senior military on 17 November 2022 to highest possible penalty of life sentence. Unfortunately, these people have still the protection of President Putin in Moscow, but nonetheless, it is important that this verdict is there. They are convicted criminals and they can't leave Russia. We hope that one day they will face their actual sentences. For family members of victims, it was a relief to hear the verdict, because the recognition of this crime and naming the ones responsible for it was very important for the justice. Therefore, it is very important that OSCE activated Moscow mechanism and the reports of experts on war crimes committed by Russia have been very clear. Collecting evidence and documenting the atrocities, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in ongoing aggressive war of Russia against Ukrainian people is hugely important and relevant. OSCE has a very valuable role to play on this, as it was mentioned by our speakers and you, many of you, my dear colleagues, this morning. Justice matters, and without justice, no peace and security is possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Gemma Araujo is the next one from Spain. Buenos días.
Ahora sí, buenos días. Perfecto, buenos días, gracias queridos colegas, buenos días a todos. A mí me gustaría intervenir en un día que yo creo que es importante y crucial para todos, y es el Día Internacional contra la Violencia de Género. En el momento en el que estamos viviendo, creo que es más necesario que nunca poner en el foco la protección de los derechos fundamentales de las mujeres, que trabajemos y aseguremos medidas que las protejan a ellas y fundamentalmente a los niños, que son las principales víctimas en cualquier conflicto armado. Pero tampoco olvidarnos que en países como el mío, en España, son ya 1.171 las mujeres muertas por violencia de género desde que hay registro y 48 menores. Hoy debemos de decir no a la violencia física, no a la violencia sexual, no a la violencia psicológica, no a la violencia económica y no a la violencia vicaria. Las mujeres están siendo utilizadas como arma de guerra y debemos en este foro conseguir adquirir compromisos que protejan a las personas más vulnerables. Ante estos difíciles momentos que estamos viviendo, las personas, y en concreto las mujeres, deben de ser el foco de las medidas que adopten los países para evitar su mayor victimización. No podemos olvidar el contexto en el que estamos y la crisis que ha provocado la invasión de Ucrania por parte de Rusia. De ahí que poniendo el foco en la protección que se le debe de dar a esas personas que se han visto desplazadas, que acojamos de buen agrado la directiva que el Consejo Europeo tomó sobre la protección temporal que ha llevado a acoger, en el caso de España, a más de 150.000 personas a las que se les ha tramitado la protección temporal, a refugiados por la guerra de Ucrania cuando se cumplen casi 9 meses de este conflicto bélico. El 61,4% de estas personas que han obtenido la protección temporal son mujeres. Por lo tanto, y en franja de edad, estamos hablando de un 34,5% tiene menos de 18 años y el 25,9% tienen entre 19 y 35. Este mecanismo que ha activado la Oficina de Asilo y Refugio, además, se adopta en un máximo de 24 horas. Pero hay una cuestión en la que tampoco debemos de apartar nuestra mirada. Lo dice una diputada de la provincia de Cádiz, situada al sur de España, en la que somos frontera sur. Para que entendáis la situación, los días claros desde mi municipio se ve África. Imagínense lo que es también ver desde el otro lado el puente de Europa como una salida a la esperanza. La presión migratoria continúa, aunque ahora entendemos que el foco debe de estar donde está situado. La responsabilidad de nuestras fronteras debe de ser compartida. La directiva de la protección temporal de la Unión Europea ha sido un gran acierto, aunque debemos de seguir cumpliendo con los valores y los derechos humanos. Muchas gracias por vuestra atención.
Thank you. The next three speakers are Nicolas Samcarazzi from Georgia, Andrei Miftode from Romania, and Paolo Rondelli from San Marino. Nicolas.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, let me express condolences to Ukrainian citizens, peaceful population that were victims of bombing on civil infrastructure recently. Of course, we strongly condemn the Russian annexation of Ukrainian sovereign territories, and we also strongly condemn the purposeful targeting of civil infrastructure, especially the power stations, to create humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. While we observe another act of aggression by Russia in a sovereign country, we also should not forget the fate of 250,000 internally displaced people in Georgia who cannot go back to their homes for the last 30 years because of Russian aggression, and the first Russian aggression that occurred as early as in 1992. The footprints of Russian aggression are very heavy for Georgian population. In the occupied territories, we have practically in the 21st century an apartheid regime where the ethnic Georgians are forced, the remaining ethnic Georgians are forced to leave the occupied territories because they are treated as a second-class citizens. The children are not allowed to have primary school instruction in Georgian language, and since they don't speak any other language, they are deprived of this essential human right. We also see the attempts of the Russian occupying power to erase the cultural track of Georgians in the occupied regions, and we also see the constant discrimination and provocations against ethnic Georgians on the occupation line and also inside the occupied territories. So this is very sad and tragic developments that we observe on Georgia's occupied territories, and we should not forget about it. The difficulty that is brought by Russian occupation was also recognized by the European Court of Human Rights which basically accused Russia of all types of human rights violations, and recently also by the International Criminal Court, which accused 4 Russian citizens for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity in Georgia in 2008. We are ready to share this experience with our Ukrainian colleagues, and we have already done so, as Georgia basically supported Ukraine in lodging the case against Russia in International Criminal Court. And we are ready to continue supporting them in this endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrei from Romania is the next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, please allow me to bring to your attention an event held in the Romanian Parliament just 2 days ago. In a joint plenary session of the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, on the 23rd of November, we adopted a declaration recognizing the Holodomor, the deliberate famine of the 1930s in Ukraine, as a crime committed against the Ukrainian people and humanity. The atrocities that Ukraine faces today may seem unprecedented. Unfortunately, they aren't. Now, as it did then, Ukraine faces crimes against its citizens of barbaric and inhumane proportions. The shelling of civilian neighborhoods, the critical energy infrastructure, power stations, water supplies, is dealing a huge blow on the Ukrainian people with devastating repercussions on civilian lives. If this continues, soon we will be able to compare the human suffering and devastation to a new Holodomor. Not one of starvation, at least not now, but one of terror, cold, darkness, and death. Each of us needs to do our utmost so that tragedies like the Holodomor do not happen again. We need to make the Russian regime realize that crimes against humanity, the violence and crimes directed at civilians, the destruction of vital civilian infrastructure is not only inefficient in promoting their agenda, but it borders on insanity, since such a criminal attitude, such a ferocious escalation can unfortunately lead to a much darker path than the one they started on. We need to convince our governments that the security of the energy supply is essential. Sharing energy and a common focus on energy security should be high on everyone's agenda in the next months. Romania strongly condemns the unprovoked and barbaric aggression committed against the Ukrainian people, both in the past and in the present, which resulted in massive violations of the most elementary human rights and freedoms of Ukrainian citizens. The Holodomor did not succeed in breaking the Ukrainian nation, and neither will this new Russian invasion, which we are witnessing today. It was not possible then, it will not be possible now. We ask the Russian leaders to come to their senses and stop their crimes, to stop the breaking of international laws, and stop reaching for new international laws. It's not too late to stop oppressing entire nation. It's not too late to leave the path of genocide and Russians' moral suicide. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one is Paolo Rondelli from San Marino.
Cari colleghi, mi sia consentito soprattutto richiamare da subito il fatto che il mio Paese oggi celebra la giornata di lotta contro la violenza alle donne. Violenza, un tipo di violenza che spesso è usato come strumento di guerra. Cari colleghi, il Parlamento di San Marino da sempre protegge le libertà e i diritti fondamentali e lo ha fatto anche in occasione del conflitto che attualmente colpisce il cuore dell'Europa. San Marino, con la sua popolazione di circa 33.000 persone, ha ospitato nel momento iniziale del conflitto oltre 300 profughi ucraini, ovvero l'1% della sua popolazione abituale. Ha ospitato e ospita ancora soprattutto donne e bambini. Ha visto in estate la nascita di un bimbo ucraino sul suo territorio e sta garantendo condizioni di vita, istruzione e lavoro quali diritti fondamentali di queste persone. La campagna di crowdfunding ha avuto grande successo di solidarietà per i profughi ucraini. A nome della delegazione sammarinese sottolineo che questo è avvenuto mentre io e il collega Oscar Mina ricoprivamo la carica pro tempore di capi dello Stato, ovvero capitani reggenti. Mi sia consentito di dire che dobbiamo condannare costantemente le aggressioni e i crimini che i conflitti si portano dietro. Ma ricordiamo sempre che il dialogo diplomatico, e lo faccio dal cuore quale ambasciatore di lungo corso prima di diventare parlamentare, il dialogo diplomatico anche a livello parlamentare deve essere alla base di qualsiasi azione e soprattutto è una base fondante della nostra organizzazione fin dalla sua creazione a Helsinki. Quindi portiamo comunque avanti un dialogo politico e diplomatico costante. Grazie.
Thank you very much, Paolo. The next three speakers are Valérie Boyer from France, John Whittingdale from UK, Monica Tsekova from Northern Macedonia. Please, Valérie. Microphone.
Je recommence. Merci, Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues. Tout d'abord, en tant que membre de la délégation française, mais aussi présidente du groupe d'amitié France-Pologne au Sénat français, je tiens à remercier le Parlement polonais et la présidence polonaise de l'OSCE de nous accueillir ici pour faire valoir depuis Varsovie le rôle essentiel de la troisième dimension humanitaire dans la crise actuelle. Notre voix doit être unanime pour exprimer notre plus vive solidarité avec l'Ukraine, et cela a été largement fait, et le peuple ukrainien. Puisse-t-elle aussi être largement entendue pour attirer notre attention sur un autre drame humanitaire, mettant en évidence des crimes de guerre et des violations graves des principes fondamentaux de l'OSCE à l'encontre d'un autre pays, je veux parler de l'Arménie. Est-ce que les vies arméniennes valent-elles moins que les vies ukrainiennes? Je pense que tous ici, ou presque tous, nous dirons non. Il ne peut y avoir deux poids, deux mesures. Et tout ce que nous déplorons pour l'Ukraine, c'est notre devoir de le dire pour l'Arménie. Crimes de guerre, crimes contre l'humanité, viols, torture. De Varsovie, je voudrais lancer un appel ce matin pour ne pas sacrifier la si fragile liberté du peuple arménien et sa survie. Premièrement, parlons du rôle des parlements nationaux. J'ai ardemment soutenu et défendu la position de la résolution du Sénat français, adoptée le 15 novembre à Paris, visant à appliquer des sanctions à l'encontre de l'Azerbaïdjan et exiger son retrait immédiat du territoire arménien et à faire respecter l'accord de cessez-le-feu du 9 novembre 2020 et favoriser toute initiative visant à établir une paix durable entre les deux pays. Parlons aussi de la médiation de l'Union européenne. Je soutiens la demande arménienne de prolongation de sa mission d'observation au-delà des 2 mois initialement convenus entre le président français Emmanuel Macron et le président du Conseil européen Charles Michel, ainsi que le président azerbaïdjanais et le Premier ministre arménien. Je demande au gouvernement français de soutenir cette prolongation. Enfin, parlons des libertés et des droits de l'homme. Nous, parlementaires de l'OSCE, pouvons et devons aussi appeler l'OSCE à agir et à se déployer pour faire prévaloir ses principes fondamentaux. J'appelle à la libération inconditionnelle et au rapatriement immédiat de tous les prisonniers de guerre arméniens actuellement détenus ou dont nous sommes sans nouvelles. Puisse l'OSCE tout mettre en œuvre pour que l'Azerbaïdjan s'engage instamment et pacifiquement dans un processus de négociation par la voie diplomatique afin d'aboutir à l'établissement et une paix durable dans le Caucase et une paix aussi équitable. Enfin, mes chers collègues, permettez-moi de vous dire qu'à juste titre, nous sommes effrayés aujourd'hui par ce qui se passe par l'hiver ukrainien pour nos amis ukrainiens. Mais n'oublions pas que l'année dernière, il s'est passé la même chose pour les personnes du Karabakh dans l'indifférence internationale. Aujourd'hui, ce que nous reprochons à la Russie pour l'Ukraine, nous devons le reprocher à l'Azerbaïdjan et à son complice turc pour l'Arménie. Je vous remercie.
Merci. John, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I think all of us in the Assembly want to support Ukraine. We're doing so by giving funds, by supplying weapons, by imposing sanctions on Russians. But this war will come to an end eventually, and we do need to consider now what should happen next. The first thing, as we've heard, is that those responsible for war crimes must be brought to justice. We have seen the pictures, the bombings of civilian areas, the mass graves, the targeting of infrastructure. These are war crimes, but they need to be properly prosecuted. And so already investigations underway. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry has said that the Russian armed forces are responsible for the vast majority of the violations that have been identified. We've heard from Matteo Mecacci about the work of the ODIHR. We know that the International Criminal Court has opened investigations and has set out guidelines, and the Ukrainian Prosecutor General has now identified 40,000 alleged war crimes, identified 600 suspects, and brought 135 charges. All of these incidents need to be properly investigated, but we also have to be realistic. Russia does not recognize the International Criminal Court. The UK first brought charges against individuals for the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London a long time ago. Russia responded by putting those people in the Duma. The UK has charges against 3 individuals in Russia for the attempted murder of the Skripal family in Salisbury and the murder of a British citizen. Those 3 individuals are still at large in Russia. And we heard from our colleague in the Netherlands of the charges brought for the destruction of MH17, and they too are against individuals who are free in Russia. I would love to see Putin in the dock. One day, perhaps it might be possible, but it seems unlikely. But that is not to say that we should not bring charges, even if they are indictments in absentia, which is a recognized formulation of the International Criminal Court. But it isn't just bringing to justice those responsible for crimes. We also need to make Russia pay reparations. The World Bank estimate was $350 billion to rebuild Ukraine, and that was calculated in June. President Zelensky has said $600 billion. The figure goes up every day. The likelihood is it will hit $1 trillion. And we need to look at how we can make Russia meet that bill. So one of the things that has been proposed, and I would ask member states here to consider, is to identify in your countries where Russia holds assets that are clearly linked to the state, and to consider ways in which laws can be passed in your countries to seize those assets and to use them for the rebuilding of Ukraine. Colleagues, Russia must be made to pay not just for its crimes, but also for the restoration of Ukraine. It is up to us to try and make that happen. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, John. Monika Tsekova from North Macedonia.
Mr. Chairman, dear colleagues, I'm sure we all agree that the world is far from a safe place to live in today. So it is more than needed to reaffirm that protection of fundamental rights and freedoms, especially in the situation of armed conflicts and humanitarian crisis, is permanent universal value and precondition for social development. Certainly, the main tool for securing protection of fundamental rights and freedoms is the existing multilateral system, including the OSCE as the world's largest regional security organization. The aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine is the biggest threat for the European security since the end of the Second World War. It is a flagrant violation of the UN Charter, OSCE commitments, the basic premises of international law and values of humanity. The war in Ukraine is particularly affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure. The OSCE participating states should assist Ukrainians in addressing the humanitarian crisis and provide constant support, both bilaterally and through multilateral mechanisms. In August this year, I had the opportunity to visit Kiev, Bucha, Irpin, and to see up close the horrors caused by the aggressor. I'm convinced that it is of more than important to end the war in Ukraine as quickly as possible, but also to hold accountable those who have committed war crimes, to support Ukrainian refugees and to help the future reconstruction of the country. Unfortunately, we could not help and return the human lives. In this regard, I would like to welcome the new OSCE support program for Ukraine. And also I want to mention that as North Macedonia assumes the responsibility of chairing the OSCE in 2023, our focus will be on continuing to make a difference on the ground, implementing the commitments made by all participating states, and rebuilding stability by restoring dialogue. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, North Macedonia. The next three speakers are Siv Mossleth from Norway, Bryndis Haraldsdottir from Iceland, and Lord Tubbs from UK. Please, Siv.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Poland, for having us here, and thank you for taking the lead in supporting Ukraine. Firstly, the Norwegian delegation strongly condemns the Russian aggression and the war in Ukraine. And Norway stands with Ukraine. But we also condemn Putin's aggression to the Russian right to speak freely. In Birmingham, we arranged a side event on political prisoners. A main concern was the situation in Russia and Belarus. I am grateful that the issue was broadly reflected in the Birmingham Declaration. And I also look forward to supporting Congressman Cohen's work as a special representative on political prisoners. But why are we so worried? No. We all knew that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of political prisoners, people put in prison for simply speaking out, as we are doing here today. And now, award-winning political prisoner in Russia, Vladimir Kara-Murza, is facing new charge. He was arrested in April 22 on charge of disobeying police orders. However, new charges have been added to these, including treason. This could lead to more than 20 years in prison. I am encouraged that the Council of Europe recently awarded him the Václav Havel Human Rights Prize. The demand for the unconditional release of political prisoners are fundamentally to democracy. And we can, as MPs, write letters to political prisoners and tell them what we are doing to protect them. And finally, I would like to mention that the Nobel Peace Prize winners for 24, Ales Bialiatis, as well as the NGO's Memorial of the Center for Civil Liberties, are three outstanding champions of human rights, democracy, and peaceful coexistence in Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next one, Bryndis from Iceland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to begin with thanking the Polish delegation and the Polish Parliament for their hospitality and well-organized meeting. But the Russian Federation war against Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis caused by it have completely altered the situation in our region. The guarantee of human rights, of fundamental freedom, has been agreed upon by all participating states. Nevertheless, every day the Russian Federation continues to violate the OSCE commitments and the international human rights law, including the most fundamental one, the right to life. The disproportionate impact of conflict and crisis on women and girls is undeniable, including the heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence and human trafficking.
We are extremely concerned about the reports and testimonies of sexual and gender-based violence committed by the Russian troops in Ukraine. Conflict-related sexual violence is never acceptable and is a war crime. Sexual and gender-based violence is a serious violation of women's human rights, a form of discrimination and an obstacle to their equal participation in public life. In 9 months now since the brutal invasion of Russia into Ukraine, an unprecedented number of people have fled. The risk of exploitation for these people are high. Many are vulnerable, women and children. These two groups make up the majority of identified victims of trafficking in human beings. Further in the past, traffickers have preyed on migration and refugees flows to exploit vulnerabilities, including trauma or lack of financial resources, housing and support system. The risk of exploitation extends to the virtual space. Online trafficking since the start of this humanitarian crisis has shown huge spikes in online search across multiple languages and countries for explicit content and sexual service from Ukrainian women and girls. We as a parliamentarian need to respond to this. The Office of the OSCE Special Representative and Coordination for Combating Traffic in Human Beings has developed a recommendation on enhancing efforts to identify and mitigate risk of trafficking in human beings online. The Icelandic delegation has recently had a meeting with Mr. Valiant Ritchie and his team to get ideas on what we as a parliamentarian can do. It was informative and a good meeting. I can recommend that for other delegations. I want to emphasize that the devastation and destruction caused by Russia's military brutal invasion must stop, as well as the recognition that it is necessary to ensure accountability for all crimes and violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. Thank you.
Thank you, Brindis. Our next speaker, Lord Tubbs from UK.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. May I join in congratulating Poland not only on this excellent plenary, but above all on the wonderful work they're doing in supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees. What Poland has done deserves all our credit. We are as far as the OSCE is concerned, we're facing, I think, the largest crisis to our values. I've been a member of the OSCE for some time, and I cannot recall a serious threat to our values as caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the brutal treatment of the Ukrainian people. And I hope that as an OSCE we'll come out of this stronger rather than weaker, but it is a serious threat to us. Could I say that there are two other points I want to make. Within the OSCE member states and within the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, there is a great deal of experience of how to deal with crises, this one and other crises. And I think that we could probably benefit by even greater coordination of what we believe in and what we do, and we can bring that experience together. For example, we can learn a great deal from each other, and we can share our experiences, our successes, and where possibly we haven't had such great successes, to the benefit of us all. So in this room there's a great repository of good experience, and I think we need to pull that together. But thirdly, and this is an ideal on my part, we have seen, in terms of the refugee crisis, we have seen difficulties we're all facing. And in an ideal world, I would like to feel that there could be a Europe-wide response to refugees based upon the highest humanitarian standards. It might not be confined to Europe, it might be as far as the OSCE countries are concerned as a whole. But certainly, I believe that we could do well if we could pull together and have a more unified approach to refugees. We've seen it as regards our approach to Ukraine, where we have acted together in a more unified way, and I think if we could do that more widely, we would be expressing true international solidarity.
Thank you very much. Following the courtesy of our Assembly, I give the floor to Asa Goulier for a short reply to our French colleague. Please, Asa.
Thank you very much, dear Reynold.
it was extremely worrying and concerning that our French colleague took a short note and to accuse Azerbaijan for nothing. I do consider that it is groundless accusation and also surprising that France, being a member of the UN Security Council, permanent member, and trying to be a moderator for the normalization process between Azerbaijan and Armenia, takes such a biased and a one-sided position. It is unacceptable. I am curious to ask my French colleague why France and the French Parliament and Senate have turned a blind eye to the occupation and aggression and the massive the war crimes committed by Armenia for the course of 30 years. Why France is not taking, objective position. This is why, dear colleagues, it doesn't help neither Armenia nor the regional peace and security. I would ask our colleague to be in line with the OSCE Helsinki principles to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the inviolability of internationally recognized borders. All the steps taken by the Senate or the Assembly is harmful and cannot be acceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have 6 more speakers. Please be as short as possible. Lilith Galstian from Armenia, Malik Ben Ashur from Belgium, Vladimir Biliak from Israel are the next 3 ones. Lilith.
Okay.
The French one.
Dear colleagues, today, rightfully, the main concern of the international community is Ukraine. But sadly, human rights, aggression, and war, regardless of nationality and geography, have the same face and the same consequences. Not so far from the European capitals, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia are continuing to be subjected to aggression, displacement, and ethnic cleansing. After the November 9 statement, Azerbaijan continues its genocidal behavior. Contrary to the provisions of the treaty, Azerbaijan did not realize all prisoners of war. During the so-called peaceful period, the number of victims among the civilian population exceeds 180. The militant rhetoric of the Azerbaijani officials, vandalism, and destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage of Nagorno-Karabakh are of continuous nature. The return of thousands of displaced people to their homes is not implemented. The Azerbaijani aggression of 2022, accompanied by horrific crimes and human rights violations that was documented and recorded, was condemned by many states, but Azerbaijan's behavior remains unchanged. 180 square kilometers of Armenian sovereign territories are still under Azerbaijani occupation. Dear colleagues, we must go one step further. If the international community is really interested in long-term peace in our region, then Azerbaijan must be held accountable as a war criminal for violations of international law, for the use of chemical weapons, for policy of ethnic cleansing, and the involvement of Turkish-backed terrorists. I refuse to believe that EU-Azerbaijan gas deal holds more worth than the real European values that unite us as an international family. Dear colleagues, contrary to Aliev's militant claims, Karabakh conflict is not resolved. The right of the people of Karabakh to self-determination has no alternative and cannot be considered resolved through aggression. And my last comment, blaming France, French Senate, and lawmakers. They never turned blind-eyed because France is a country that believed in international law and especially in the right of Nagorno-Karabakh people to self-determination.
Thank you. Malik is the next.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Alors, la solidarité des peuples européens à l'égard de l'Ukraine, elle est massive
et elle est sans ambiguïté. L'agression russe, ses exactions et ses crimes devront être jugés et punis et aucune impunité n'est envisageable. Alors que les bombes russes s'abattent sur les hommes, sur les femmes et sur les enfants ukrainiens, la Russie utilise contre les Européens l'arme énergétique. Des travailleurs, des familles, des entreprises d'Europe sont aujourd'hui en première ligne pour subir des factures de gaz ou d'électricité qui deviennent impossibles à payer. Cette explosion des prix de l'énergie, voulue par la Russie, nourrit une inflation susceptible de plonger notre continent dans une crise économique et sociale majeure, grave et structurelle. Hier, la Commission européenne s'est à nouveau montrée incapable de sortir l'énergie de la pure logique du marché et de plafonner les prix du gaz sur base d'un mécanisme ambitieux et efficace, et ce, malgré la volonté exprimée par de nombreux États membres. Cette incapacité de la Commission à avancer sur des solutions capables de dompter, de maîtriser ce marché de l'énergie devenu fou sous l'effet de la malveillance russe pourrait avoir des conséquences très directes en termes d'effondrement démocratique et d'adhésion à la cause ukrainienne. Cet enjeu est donc capital. Or, nous avons des alliés dans cet effort de guerre, des alliés qui sont aussi des producteurs de gaz, la Norvège par exemple, les États-Unis aussi. Et je voudrais ici dire à ces pays, nous soutenons l'effort de guerre, nous, Européens, nous le faisons avec conviction, mais aidez-nous à préserver l'adhésion de nos populations à cet effort de guerre. Et pour cela, vous devez agir rapidement pour faire baisser les prix de l'énergie et atténuer cette inflation qui mène des familles entières aux portes de la pauvreté, des entreprises vers la faillite et nos États vers un endettement insoutenable. Et pour cela, puisque nous sommes amis, acceptez de nous vendre votre gaz à prix d'amis. Ne sous-estimons pas cette question, il y a derrière elle un enjeu majeur de cohésion et de démocratie absolument décisif. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Vladimir, and the last three speakers, I have to announce it, they have only 2 minutes, sorry. Vladimir, please.
Okay, thank you very much, dear colleagues, уважаемые коллеги. Я сомневался, на каком языке говорить, и решил говорить на русском по двум причинам. Во-первых, это язык моего детства, в котором сама вероятность военного конфликта между Россией и Украиной была фантастической. И кроме того, я думаю, важно, чтобы сегодня на этом форуме еще раз слова поддержки Украине прозвучали именно на русском языке. С первых дней этой войны Израиль занял принципиальную позицию поддержки территориальной целостности и суверенитета Украины. Эта позиция нашла свое выражение в голосовании Израиля на сессиях Организации Объединенных Наций. Отмечу, что Израиль не признает результаты так называемых референдумов, проведенных в нескольких областях Украины незаконным образом. Израиль однозначно осуждает эту агрессию, нарушение прав человека и разрушение инфраструктуры украинских городов. Наша солидарность с народом Украины находит свое выражение в больших объемах гуманитарной помощи, которую мы предоставляем. Мы были первой страной, которая открыла полевой госпиталь в первые дни войны в районе Львова. Он действовал в течение 6 недель, и тысячи раненых и больных получили медицинскую помощь. Мы осуществляем постоянные поставки медицинского и иного оборудования правительства Украины. Каски, бронежилеты, средства гражданской обороны. Десятки раненых украинских детей получают сегодня медицинскую и психологическую помощь в больницах Израиля. Израиль, разумеется, готов принять активное участие в послевоенном восстановлении Украины. Мы будем продолжать и расширять нашу помощь народу Украины и сделаем все возможное, чтобы эта ужасная война закончилась как можно скорее. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. The last three speakers, Anton Reno from Spain, Sargis Katanian from Armenia, and Mark Demesmaeker from Belgium. Please, Anton.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Bueno, creo en primer lugar que hay que felicitar a los ponentes que han hecho creo que una acertada exposición, centrando la cuestión más en fomentar argumentos de seguridad y de paz y por lo tanto de diálogo que en argumentos que alimentan la guerra. Creo que eso es la perspectiva que tenemos que tener en este debate, en esta organización, sobre todo porque si el debate en curso va de pensar qué papel tenemos que jugar en la reconstrucción, para la reconstrucción tenemos que pensar y plantear qué papel vamos a jugar para conseguir que haya una paz, evidentemente una paz justa en el que se respete, digamos, la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. Más allá de eso, bueno, dos cuestiones. Creo que hay alguna gente, digamos, en nuestras sociedades que tiene sorprendentemente una especie de nostalgia de un mundo dividido en bloques, nostalgia de un mundo dividido en dos bloques. Yo creo que tenemos que trabajar denodadamente para que eso no suceda. Creo que lo peor para el desarrollo, para las democracias, para la paz del conjunto, digamos, de nuestro espacio geopolítico es precisamente dividirnos en dos bloques nuevamente o dividirnos en bloques. Creo que es fundamental, por lo tanto, que digamos que luchemos contra esa perspectiva de división en bloques geopolíticos. Por otra parte, creo que hay que poner en valor esta organización precisamente como una de las pocas organizaciones, digamos, que tiene en su seno, pues lo que tiene, digamos, la cuestión del bloque euroasiático, digamos, de lo que tiene que ver con los países estrictamente europeos y los países asiáticos. Creo que es imprescindible para un futuro en paz, no solo en estos continentes, sino en el conjunto del ámbito global, pues que haya una buena relación entre estos bloques, más allá, evidentemente, de las diferencias políticas, económicas y de perspectivas también culturales que podamos tener. Y por eso, bueno, creo que esta organización es fundamental también para pensar eso. Y para acabar, bueno, en las ponencias se habló también, digamos, de la vulneración de derechos humanos que se dio en la guerra. Creo que bueno, una de las vulneraciones que también tenemos que poner, digamos, en perspectiva es la vulneración del derecho a la información, la vulneración del trabajo precisamente de los profesionales y las profesionales que trabajan en el mundo de la información y de garantizarnos a todas las sociedades ese derecho en libertad. Creo que ahí tenemos que señalar pues, los constantes abusos que ha cometido la Federación Rusa contra la libertad de información, pero creo que también, bueno, el resto de países tenemos que poner el foco en que no hemos sido capaces en algunos casos de garantizar también esta libertad de información. Y cierro ya con una cuestión que bueno, en el Estado español preocupa, que es bueno, la detención de un periodista, Pablo González, que sigue pues, desde hace más de 6 meses retenido a juicio de muchas personas en la sociedad civil española, bueno, sin cargos y además en una situación que se está vulnerando lo que tiene que ver con sus garantías y con el Estado de Derecho. Por lo tanto, bueno, reivindicar el papel de los periodistas en esta crisis y particularmente el papel de este periodista.
The next speaker is from Armenia. Please, 2 minutes.
Mr. Chair, Azerbaijan's unjustified and unprovoked military aggression against the sovereign territory of the Republic of Armenia, launched on September 13 this year, resulted in grave humanitarian consequences for the peaceful population living close to the eastern border of Armenia. Shelling of 36 towns and villages, displacement of 7,600 civilians, including 1,500 children, the targeting of hundreds of residential houses, hotels, schools, medical facilities, media personnel, killing of 211 Armenians, including civilians. Days after this aggression, horrific videos appeared in Azerbaijani social media showing the extrajudicial executions of unarmed Armenian soldiers. The dead bodies of Armenian female military personnel were mutilated and then video recorded by the Azerbaijani servicemen. A couple of weeks ago, 2 years after the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the president of Azerbaijan delivered a hate-fueled speech glorifying these crimes and justifying the occupation of the sovereign territory of Armenia. In this speech, Aliyev brags that the armed forces of Azerbaijan have been stationed at key strategic heights, listing the names of the geographical locations of his possible new targets in Armenia. Armenia should understand well what this means. All this should be a lesson for Armenia, he said. These locations are towns and villages in Armenia where thousands of peaceful people live, and the president of Azerbaijan directly threatens these people. He has a message for the international community as well. If we were afraid of someone, we would have never started the Second Karabakh War, he said. Dear colleagues, one of the guiding principles of the OSCE adopted in its founding document is refraining from the threat or use of force. The Helsinki Final Act clearly declares that the participating state should refrain from any acts constituting a threat of force or direct or indirect use of force against another participating state. This assembly must be very firm in protecting this principle and should be very vocal in condemning the violations of this principle. Thank you.
Thank you. Last speaker, Mark Damesmaker, and then our colleagues. Thank you.
Yes.
Mark.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, colleagues, it's quite obvious that Russia is causing humanitarian disaster and committing war crimes on an unseen scale. They do it deliberately, they do it systematically, and we support, of course, the call to bring the perpetrators to justice. Now, when I visited Kiev back in April, being confronted with the destruction of civil buildings and infrastructure, being confronted with the mass grave of Bucha, one of the many, with cold-blooded execution of civilians, torture, rapes, you can't help but wonder who are the people who commit these crimes. This is not the war of one man. It is only possible when a significant portion of the population supported and participated. And we have seen this before in our history. What we see happening is rooted in something broader, in the shift towards more and more authoritarian policy and repressive policy. It starts with harassing civil society, destroying civil society, harassing political opposition, persecuting political opposition, murdering political opponents, harassing free media and independent media and outlawing them, and instrumentalization of the state media. It is with disgust that I have seen the systematic spreading of a hate ideology by the state media in Russia. Do you remember Radio Milkolin in Rwanda, when this outlet was responsible there for spreading of hate and is seen as one of the catalysts of genocide? With state media in Russia, which are calling for torturing of civilians as a necessity for peace, who are openly and systematically calling for the annihilation of Ukraine, well, Russia has its own versions of Radio Milkolin. Putin doesn't need to defend himself for committing atrocities. His media openly approve and encourage him even to go further. This is a sick situation Russia finds itself in after decades of drifting towards authoritarianism. Our own democracies, with free opposition, with vibrant civil societies, with free media, we often take them for granted, but we shouldn't. We should cherish, promote, encourage at home and be on alert, not only at home, but wherever and whenever they are being targeted and are in danger. And we have to find real mechanisms also in this organization to uphold the values and principles we agreed on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, colleagues from Azerbaijan and France asked to take the floor, but sorry, we don't have time anymore. Maybe you can do it bilateral. Sorry. We have time limits. So I give the floor to Radoslav and then to Matteo, and then our President, Margareta, will start with the closing session.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank all the speakers for your contributions, for your interventions. I think this debate proved how important the issue of human rights during armed conflicts is, and I hope that everyone gets a lot from this debate and brings these ideas home so we can work in our national parliaments on improving the legal framework and the possibility to act by organizations like OSCE. I would like to just share one thought concluding this, because one cannot talk about human rights if there is no mechanism to protect them and to ensure that they are respected. So that's why it's so important that every act of crime, every war crime, every war criminal from Russia has to be brought to justice, and Russia needs to pay reparations for this barbaric war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radoslav.
Thank you.
Matteo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like also to thank all the members of the Assembly who have made their statement. Also, thank those who have expressed support to the work of ODIHR as an institution. This is very important for us. We do have a strong partnership with you, and we want to continue to move forward and make progress. I would just say a few words. I think it's very clear from this discussion that there is a strong consensus on the need for accountability when it comes to human rights violations in the cases of conflicts. We need to remember that this is not always the case, and it has been mentioned by some that the international community is not able to respond in a consistent way when this type of events happen. When I was young and I started my career, I was in Rome for the diplomatic conference established the International Criminal Court. We still have a big number of countries in the world who have not ratified the statute, including 3 members of the UN Security Council. So these are things that we need to keep in mind as we want to make sure that as a result of this war, we do not only have the European security architecture put into question, but potentially also the international human rights system that we have fought for many years, especially in the 90s, to establish. So I think this is a call to each of you, to each of us, to try to make sure that the rise of conflicts, the rise of nationalism do not undermine even more the international institutions that have been established exactly to make sure that these principles are implemented. Only also a few words acknowledging the members of parliament who spoke about the question of gender-based violence. This is an issue of utmost concern. It is a priority for our work, actually for our cooperation. On Monday, we will be presenting together, I think Heidi Frey will be speaking at our event on a new toolkit that we have established concerning the violence against women who are involved in politics, because we now see the target moving from societies also to the women who are now speaking out for the rights, for gender-based rights, to make sure that they are not able to do that in the future. So this is something that specifically we see in the context of Ukraine, and it is true, it requires specific expertise and specific knowledge to be able to address this situation in a meaningful way. So these are all issues on which we count on your cooperation, your expertise, and I think that the leadership that the OSCE PA can continue to have on these issues cannot be underestimated, because as it has been mentioned, it is an assembly that brings together countries with different political systems, different traditions, different culture, but is an important space for dialogue and for continued progress on the field of the human dimension. Thank you very much.
Matteo, thank you very much. We can continue our discussion with you in some minutes, but before this, we have the closing session. Please stay in the room. We will continue in 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
press it here on.
Dear colleagues, please take your seats. We are now coming to the closing of the Parliamentary Conference of our autumn meeting here in Warsaw. And I would like to start to say thank you for all your active participation in the debates. And before I give the floor to the first speaker in the closing session, I would like to also to address that out of solidarity with people of Ukraine who lives in darkness, we will hold this session in darkness, no light. If you need light, please use the flashlight on your cell phones.
Everybody can turn on torches if they can do all like this.
Yes, but I have no cell phone, so I can't do it.
Okay, but if everybody can put their phones up like this, we want to make a photo op.
It will be a photo. If you please can hold up your cell phones. So, thank you. And now, I will give the floor to Secretary General Montella for some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me first say a big, warm, and very much heartfelt thank you to Barbara and the Polish Parliament and the Polish delegation. Thank you very much, Barbara, for hosting us here. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Marcin, Natalia, Carolina, all those who have worked on this session. You have delivered in no time, let's say. We asked you to do this in very, very short deadline. Gustavo and my colleagues in the conference team, they know that when we organize these meetings, we spend maybe a year or two going to visit the country, doing some preparatory visits. Here you were asked to organize this and you delivered in a very, very short time. So thank you very much to you, Barbara, to the Speaker of to the Marshal of the Sejm, to the Marshal of the Senate, to all the authorities in Poland for the great work that you've done. I would like to extend also the thank you to Poland for the work that the chairman in office has done this year. Poland has held the chairmanship of the organization in a very difficult year, We will get to that. But also, Barbara, you have helped us also visit the areas of Poland which were receiving hubs for Ukrainian refugees in March. We would like to thank you also for that. I think the Polish people have shown an incredible solidarity, an incredible capacity to go beyond, let's say, their own skin to help the incoming refugees from Ukraine. And for that, I think all of this room and everyone in this room is very appreciative of the work that Poland has done. Thank you, Barbara. Now, let me say that it's great that this event takes place in person. The alternative would have been that we would have had an online meeting. And I think in this incredible, difficult geopolitical situation that we are living in Europe, I think it was very important parliamentarians could meet in person, could talk to each other, could send strong messages. I have not been following very much the debates in the room because I was also busy with preparations also of what we are about to do this afternoon in the Standing Committee, but I've been informed that there's been very heated debates, sometimes on the issues that were in the agenda, but also, and it's inevitable, of course, comments and discussions also on the general political situation that we are living in Europe. Let me say that I am extremely proud of this assembly. I'm extremely proud of the fact that in this assembly there's always been unity, and I use this word very carefully, but there has always been unity on condemning the Russian Federation for its acts in Ukraine. There's always been unity, unanimous support for Ukraine. There's never been any divisions in this assembly. From 2014, when many other delegations, many other international bodies were still wavering. This assembly from 2014 has called a spade to a spade, has said there are clear, gross, uncorrected violations of the Helsinki Final Act. This was said in Baku in 2014, and it was repeated in Birmingham. So this assembly has had an impeccable track record in supporting Ukraine, in condemning Russia, and in calling who is the aggressor and who is the victim. Madam President, since 24th of February in Vienna, you've had a strong leadership of this assembly. You spoke at every possible fora defending the positions of this assembly. There is no doubt in this assembly where we stand, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion also in this room. There will be a lot in the next two meetings that we are about to undertake. Some of you, the heads of delegations, will participate in the Standing Committee where we are discussing some more procedural aspects. But I would like to make sure that the message that comes out from this room, from the Polish Sejm, is that this assembly has no doubts where we are when it comes to calling who is the aggressor and who is the victim and who we give our support to. And this is your work, your words in public documents, in the declarations that you've made in Baku and since the annual session in Baku in 2014 to the one leading to 2022 in Birmingham. And so for this, I am very proud of being in this assembly because I very much respect the courage, the work that you've had. I hope that the discussions we will have in the afternoon in the Standing Committee will not overshadow this clear message that should come out of this, because there's been a trend, to say, okay, well, if the OSCE cannot, because of some procedural and some legal aspects of its own rules of procedure, cannot pass some resolution, then what's the point, or is it really this assembly, has it failed in its task? No, the assembly has not failed in its task. This is a political body, and the message that this political body has passed on in every possible fora has been unequivocal, and I think this should be the message that comes out of this meeting at the conclusion of this meeting. The next two meetings, as I said, are the Standing Committee this afternoon, where we will discuss also our internal issues, budget, report of the Secretary General, the report of the President, and indeed also an issue of a possible change of our rules of procedure. And then tomorrow we will have a bureau, and I think the bureau comes at a very, very timely moment, because for the first time tomorrow we will do a different type of bureau. The President has presented a vision paper an idea for where the Assembly should go in the next year. And tomorrow will be a little reflection of first the elected leadership, let's say, of this Assembly, to think a little bit of who we are as an Assembly, what we do. Should we have 3 sessions every year? Should we have 2 sessions? Should we have an annual session of 5 days, 4 days? Should we vote on the first day rather than the last day? You remember what happened in Birmingham with the early vote, etc., etc. So we will be reflecting a little bit on mandates of vice presidents, all the things that are in the Assembly, voting procedures, how we amend the rules of procedure. Should there be consensus for some things? Should there be some aspects in our rules that when a country violates every single possible article of the Helsinki Decalogue, there should be some sanctions? So all of these things will be reflected upon tomorrow in the Bureau meeting. And the Bureau, which will be kind of in a brainstorming session, let's say, will then inform a process that will start, which is a process of reform of our rules of procedure. And hopefully, in the coming months or hopefully in the coming year, we will have new rules of procedure, which will allow our Assembly to be even more modern, and will be able, also with our tools, the legal tools, to accompany what already exists, which is a great political engagement, a great political will. I've seen the 2 biggest election observation missions in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and the United States, with most of you present there. So it shows your commitment to this organization, your commitment to the values of this organization, and for this I would like to commend. 2 more points. One, I would like to thank the director of the ODIHR, Matteo Mecacci, who also invites us after this closing session to a reception at the ODIHR. We work very well with the ODIHR, as you know. Matteo Mecacci was a member of our Assembly. He was the head of the 3rd committee, I think. And it's very nice to have him at the ODIHR, since he has become a director of the ODIHR, but also with Michael Link before. Our relations with the ODIHR are even stronger. We work very well in many different aspects, not only on election observation, but on democratization, many issues. So, Matteo, thank you very much for participating here today, and thank you for inviting us to the reception, which will take place after this event. And the last point is on the staff of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. I should have said this more in the standing committee, but I mean, as we have more members here, I would like to express it also here. I am the Secretary General of this organization. My responsibility is to manage the staff and to ensure that the finances are managed well. I mean, this is mostly what I respond to, and of course, making sure that the rules are adhered to and respected. But all of you have interacted with the staff of this Parliamentary Assembly. You know, in all areas where we operate, be it management of committees, on election observation, working with the president, working with different special representatives. Our staff is really doing an incredible professional work, but not only professional, also putting their heart in going beyond, let's say, they're doing the extra mile to ensure that you are properly served and properly assisted when you need. So thank you very much also to my colleagues, and with this I conclude, Madam President.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your closing remarks. And now I will give my closing remarks. Madam Bartos, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin to thank all of you for your strong engagement in our autumn meeting. It's tough to be here for 2 days, full schedule, to meet, to debate, to exchange views. At the same time, have the pressure from back home, what's happening back home on the political arena, and what's happened outside, because as politicians, we are not isolated. We are part of the world. But you have done a great job, and it's my true pleasure to serve as President of the Assembly. And I would also like to say that our time here together, it has been limited, but we will meet soon again for the winter meeting in Vienna. And I am really grateful that Poland have hosted us here, because it's our second meeting in person after the COVID, after more than 2.5 years break of meetings. We have met once again. And I think this is important. It's in some way a new arena because some of our colleagues have left. There have been elections back home in the national parliaments. Some colleagues have left, they haven't been re-elected. Some colleagues are new because they have been appointed, elected in their national parliament to our assembly. And this is exactly what's so important and great in OSCE PA, that we can work together and we can share our views, not only between countries and parties, also with new members and old members. I think this is something that we should use very much because there is always another perspective that's important. And I started to say also to Barbara Bartos that I think we all should be grateful to Poland who gave us this opportunity. Thank you. During these 2 days, we have had an opportunity to, on the agenda, it has been focused on Russia's war in Ukraine. It has been debates on the consequences for European security. And this means it's actually the base, the fundament of OSCE and the OSCE PA, the European Security Order, that some people says is out of order. It's out of order because it's not respected by Russia. But we who are here, we have to continue to work, to strive for the respect for the European Security Order, because that's the legal fundament that our work are based on, and it's in the Helsinki Final Act. But I would also say that there is also other issues that's of high importance for us to discuss. And I say that because we need to also prevent new conflicts, new risk for conflicts. And why do we have to do this as parliamentarians? It's obvious. We are elected by the people, and I expect that we serve them, that we are acting in a responsible way so it's possible to live a life wherever you are in peace and dignity. And that's what we should strive for. And I haven't been able to be here with you because I have had a lot of other meetings related to this conference, because the Standing Committee is meeting later this afternoon. And let me just say that there shouldn't be an end to our work. We, as parliamentarians, we should continue to strive for a better world. There are rules, we need to stick to them, but also it's we who set the rules. It's nobody else. We can't say that it's somebody else who have decided. It's we who make the decision. And I think this is one important issue for us to always bear with us. But I know that the speakers that have been here have high competence, high level of engagement, high level of experience. And I spoke with one of our speakers this morning, Mr. Avad, and he came up with very good ideas also, how we could continue our work as a parliamentary assembly, how we could be more focused on what we can do. So I will return with also some thoughts about this, because everything is not always rules. It's also what we want to do and how we do things. But we should never break the rules. If we break the rules, then we have no framework. I would also say that the first session, it discussed the impact of the war on our multilateral rules-based order. And as we face the political and operational paralysis of the OSCE, we debated ways for our assembly, how our assembly could help keep OSCE fully functional. Because it's no secret. I say it here because I think it's important to be aware of what have happened in the OSCE governmental side. Because that's what most people talk about. Russia have blocked the decision on adoption of the budget. There is procedure for how to use the budget, so that it's still working. There is also the block of the SMM, so there is no more ice from OSCE in Donetsk, Luhansk, or at the border. Russia have also blocked the decision for chair of OSCE 2024. It's Estonia, it's blocked. And I can continue with this, like the Human Dimension Conference, HDM. That's not happened, but Poland arranged it. It's also the Ministerial Council that they tried to block, but Poland arranged. This shows that there is always a way forward if you really want to do it, even when there is a no from some parts. I would also like to say that it's also reflect that we as parliamentarians, we have another organization, even if we are in the same family, but we need to stick together and support each other. And I would also like to say here, because we are going to Udir for a visit, that there is quite a lot of institutions inside OSCE who works very well. And I hope that we can get closer to those and know a bit more about what is done. Udir, we know them. We cooperate when it's election observations. But there is also missions in countries. There is an academy in Bishkek. There is the Peace and Security Center in Tajikistan. There is a lot of well-functioning operations, missions, and it's something that we should be so proud of and really salute. But I would also like to say here that even if we are doing some small sacrifice, it's nothing compared to what our colleagues in Ukraine do. No electricity, lack of water, no hot water. Look at the shelves in the food stores, what they look like. I could continue with this. But I would also say, what does it look like in our countries when we have our debates back home in our national parliament? And we know it when we go to the stores. We hear it from our voters. High prices on food, inflation, high rent, lack of energy. This shows that the war is not only Russia's war against Ukraine, it's Russia's war against all of us. And we, as parliamentarians, with the fundament of the European security order, we have to defeat it. We have to bring peace back in our part of the world. But I would also like to say that we, as parliamentarians, we are strong, and I am really pleased to see what has been done here today. And I am pleased that we will go to Udir, and I am pleased that we will meet in Warsaw, and that we will continue with our election observations, because we are fighting also for democracy. And I would like to say that after the closing, there is, as Secretary General said, there will be the standing committee. And I will use that meeting also to search for support for continued work forward. I mention this because even if it's the head of delegations who take part there, those who have the decision rights, we are all members of the Assembly. And I think it's important that all members are informed about what's happened and what will be the will be discussed. But once again, even what we do here, bring it with you back home, dear colleagues. Use it in your national parliament. It's there you take the decision on how to support in practice for Ukraine or for other parts. It's there you take the decision on your legal statement on your budget, and that's needed. It's there you ask your government to act responsible, what they have done with their decisions. But use what you have here with you, because then we can be really strong if we are putting our national seat together with what we do here in our Parliamentary Assembly. And I would also like to say here at the end, thank you to Secretary General, and thank you to all the members of the International Secretariat. We need them as parliamentarians because they have the expertise, they have the knowledge, and with cooperation with them, we can go forward. So thank you once again. And I would also like to say thank you to the staff of the Polish Sejm for your work and for what you have done to serve us here. Thank you so much. Thank you, dear colleagues. And now I will give the floor to the head of the Polish delegation, Ms. Barbara Bartos. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo. Szanowna Pani Przewodnicząca, znamienici parlamentarzyści, dostojni goście, szanowny Panie Sekretarzu Generalny, Szanowni Państwo. Są takie chwile, które każą zadać pytanie, czy zrobiliśmy wszystko, by powstrzymać krwawą rzeź? Czy wyciągnęliśmy wnioski z tej i poprzednich wojen? Historia niestety kołem się toczy, a raczej gąsienicą czołgów. Pamiętamy z historii słowa premiera Wielkiej Brytanii Chamberlaina o dalekich krajach, o których niewiele wiemy. Zbójecka napaść Rosji na Ukrainę na szczęście obudziła sumienia wielu polityków, którzy zrozumieli, że wydarzenia w dalekim kraju dotyczą ich bardziej niż sądzili. Wsparcie dla Ukrainy daje nadzieję, że wyciągamy wnioski z konfliktów, a prowadzenie polityki w drodze kolejnych mordów nie jest drogą do osiągania zamierzonych celów. Kolejna agresja na Ukrainę, wspomagana narodowym szowinizmem Rosjan, którzy odmawiają Ukraińcom prawa do bycia odrębnym narodem, wskazuje, że ryzyko kolejnych rzezi i mordów powraca z niepokojącą regularnością. Dlatego też szczególnego znaczenia nabiera wysiłek społeczności międzynarodowej w celu powstrzymania takich strasznych konfliktów. Nie można przy tym nie wspomnieć, że wojna wymusiła rewizję niektórych poglądów, na przykład takiego, że wysyłanie broni ofierze napaści rzekomo eskaluje konflikt, a brak takiego wsparcia pozwala zachować rzekomo równe szanse stron konfliktu. To nie są równe strony konfliktu i nie można stwarzać wrażenia, że zachowuje się równy dystans do agresora i jego ofiary. A samo prowadzenie rozważań, których celem jest zrozumienie motywacji kierujących agresorem, jest przykładem hańby pseudointelektualistów, którzy takie rozważania prowadzą. Szanowni Państwo, jesienna sesja OBWE odbyła się w Warszawie, która jest miastem wzniesionym z ruin. Doszczętnie zniszczona w czasie II wojny światowej została odbudowana i dziś stanowi żywy pomnik ludzkiej woli przetrwania, która jest w stanie przezwyciężyć każde zło. Ufamy, że takiej woli przetrwania nie zabraknie narodowi ukraińskiemu, który wspierany przez społeczność międzynarodową po zwycięskiej wojnie z Rosją nadal będzie kroczyć ścieżką do dobrobytu i nowej, lepszej przyszłości. Drodzy koledzy parlamentarzyści, Jest jednak nadzieja, którą jest jak dawniej. Solidarność wspólnoty międzynarodowej, która przeciwstawia się brutalnej, napastniczej wojnie. Znajdujemy się w niezwykłym momencie historii OBWE i naszego zgromadzenia. Jak było to wielokrotnie podnoszone podczas naszych obrad, za chwilę staniemy przed historycznym i strategicznym wyborem. Czy możemy rozmawiać przy jednym stole ze zbrodniarzami, którzy nie przestrzegają żadnych zasad, nawet najbardziej elementarnych, zasad, na które wszyscy się zgodziliśmy? Każdy z nas ma swoje zdanie na ten temat. Czasem pewne wątpliwości. Jednak na koniec dnia trzeba podjąć jasną i odważną decyzję. Nasza debata potwierdziła wspólne wielkie marzenie o pokoju i dobrobycie. Marzenie o silnej, bezpiecznej i solidarnej Europie, opartej na wspólnych wartościach. Szanowni Państwo, kończąc, dziękuję wszystkim za przyjazd do stolicy Polski i aktywny udział w naszym jesiennym posiedzeniu. Dziękuję pani przewodniczącej Margarecie Sederfeld, panu sekretarzowi generalnemu za to, że możemy właśnie spotkać się w polskim parlamencie. Dziękuję przewodniczącej litewskiej delegacji pani Willi za przygotowanie i przedstawienie nam pięknej, ważnej wystawy Wyzwolenie i obrona. Szczególne podziękowania kieruję do marszałek Sejmu, polskiego Sejmu pani Elżbiety Witek i marszałka Senatu pana Tomasza Grodzkiego. Dziękuję całej naszej delegacji. Bardzo serdecznie dziękuję. Przyłączam się do tych podziękowań, które tutaj już były. Pani minister Agnieszce Kaczmarskiej, pani dyrektor Karolinie Głowackiej i naszemu sekretarzowi polskiej delegacji, panu Marcinowi Myketeńskiemu, bo bez ich determinacji i prawie całodobowej pracy to wszystko by się w tak krótkim czasie nie udało. Dlatego też dziękuję za uznanie kierowane przez Państwa. Tak, to była praca, ale to była ważna praca i radością było to, co mówiłam, że możemy tutaj właśnie o sytuacji na Ukrainie, o tej wojnie rozmawiać. Mam nadzieję, że spotkam się też z Państwem podczas dzisiejszego wieczornego przyjęcia, gdzie będziemy mogli dokończyć nasze rozmowy i to już w takiej formie mniej formalnej. Do zobaczenia na kolejnych sesjach, a dzisiaj jeszcze podczas Komisji Stałej, wcześniej w ODIHR-ze i wieczorem tam, gdzie się spotkamy. Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you, Ms. Bartos, for your personal efforts once again. And I would also say that your work that made it possible for us to meet here. But dear colleagues, this concludes our 2022 autumn meeting. And this afternoon, our standing committee will meet to carry out with some of the debates we have had yesterday and today. But I would also like to say that there is the networking reception hosted by ODIHR, and if I'm informed right, there is bus transportation, otherwise I'm sure the Secretariat can give more information. And I wish all of you a safe trip back home and a good time with your parliamentarian duties, and I look forward to see you 2023 in Vienna. Thank you very much and best wishes.